Chapter 904. The benefits of setting up the Huaxia shipping group were obvious, but it was not without resistance. It was inevitable that the interests of the three royal merchants would suffer in the short term. Of course, this was just a minor problem. Once the shipping group was set up, even if the three royal merchants wanted to continue the shipping business, they would not be able to compete with the group. The two sides were incomparable in terms of resources, brands, and strength. The biggest problem was the lack of talent. Today, with the improvement of the dynasty's education system and talent selection system, there was no shortage of low-level officials in the dynasty. What they lacked was modern business management talents. To operate the huge Huaxia shipping group, they needed thousands of professionals. It was impossible to support such a huge shipping group by relying on NPCs. If they wanted to do a good job, they needed elite management talents, or even the best professional managers. In this regard, Di Chun and the others had a unique advantage. They could directly mobilize the talents of their families. Ouyang Shuo could not do it, so he could only hire them with high salaries. Fortunately, the Great Xia dynasty was no longer a nobody, and its influence among the players could not be underestimated. With a large number of professional modern talents, such as Meng Jida, Chun Bingguang, Lu Mo, and Gong Jian being put in important positions in the Great Xia dynasty, the Great Xia dynasty's attractiveness to high-end talents was rapidly increasing. At the same time, the Great Xia dynasty had conducted several large-scale player recruitment operations, which basically eliminated the previous impression of the territory as closed off and was already extremely friendly to players. Therefore, it was not very difficult for the dynasty to recruit a group of professional management talents. They just needed time and patience. In addition, top business management talents were still hard to come by. This was the congenital deficiency of the Great Xia dynasty, and it could only be slowly made up for. In addition to public recruitment, Ouyang Shuo was also preparing to mobilize other channels to recruit talents, such as the Song family. As one of the four major families in Lingnan, although the Song family's influence was not comparable to that of Di Chun and the others, they could still exert a lot of power and introduce talents to the dynasty. This was something that Song Tianxiong was happy to see. In addition, there was the Feng family led by Feng Qiuhuang. The Feng family was the top family in China, and they naturally had a lot of power. The current fallen Phoenix City could not absorb so many talents, especially talents in the port and shipping industry. Therefore, it was reasonable to introduce a group of people to the Great Xia dynasty. Then, there were the friends of the Great Xia dynasty, including Snow Rose Mercenary Group, Baleful Blood Mercenary Group, Blood Shadow Alliance, Rivers and Mountain Alliance, and a Thread. The members of the guild were not professionals, but they had big families behind them. China's network was intricate to begin with, and by following the vines to the melons, they would always be able to attract a group of talents. Even for some adventurer players, if Huaxia Shipping Group gave them good treatment, they could be transferred to civilian jobs. Xiesiun, Crimson Romance, and the others had already promised Ouyang Shuo that as long as these people wanted to leave, the guild wouldn't stop them. This could already be considered a great show of support. The same logic applied to the millions of players who had migrated to the Great Xia dynasty. The relationship between the Great Xia dynasty and the players in the China region was becoming closer and closer. Tying the interests of the ordinary players with the interests of the dynasty was Ouyang Shuo's long-term strategy. After listening to Cui Yingyo's plan, Bai Shui and the others were so shocked that they couldn't close their mouths. As the head manager of a top merchant group, Bai Shui thought that their usual business activities were already big enough, but they paled in comparison to the dynasty's operations. Huaxia Shipping Group's valuation was equivalent to their entire merchant group. Seeing this, Song Tianxiong looked at Ouyang Shuo meaningfully. Without a doubt, even though Cui Yingyu had announced this plan, the person behind it was definitely the young emperor. Cui Yingyu might have grasped many modern business methods, but she didn't have this kind of courage. Only this young man dared to do what others didn't dare to do, and think what others didn't dare to think about. He dares to be the first in the world. Song Tianxiong suddenly thought of this adjective. Seeing this, Ouyang Shuo smiled. After the reorganization, the imperial court won't take advantage of you. According to the value of the combined fleet and personnel, you'll be considered as the shares of Huaxia Shipping Group. Since the Commerce Department still controlled the fleet, the three royal merchants would hold around 2 to 3% of the shares, with the highest being no more than 3%. In addition, the Bank of the Four Seas would invest 1.5 million gold coins as the starting capital and recruitment funds for the shipping group, taking up 5% of the shares. According to this estimate, once the shipping group was established, it would be valued at 30 million gold coins. Such a valuation was naturally high. The Bank of the Four Seas investment was calculated based on the group's future profits. Thank you for your grace, your majesty. Song Tianxiong and the other two were smart people. Holding shares not only meant dividends, but it also meant that the merchant group would have an advantage in the shipping group business compared to other merchant groups. They would have more influence and say. The intangible value of this part was immeasurable. Therefore, Ouyang Shua's proposal could be said to be a favor. This could also be considered as a repayment for the selfless help of the three royal merchants during the Battle of Morocco. Between the two, it was mutually beneficial. After clearing up the relationship between the three royal merchants, the preparations for Huaxia Shipping Group officially began. Because the shipping group would be under the jurisdiction of the Industry and Development Department of the Finance Department, Cui Yingyu was fully in charge. The recruitment notice had already been posted on the prominent pages of the major media in the China region, and it caused a stir. In the 9 king cities, there would always be some unaccomplished players who couldn't display their expertise in the game. When they saw the recruitment notice from the Great Xia dynasty, they smiled in relief. They had finally waited for the opportunity they had been dreaming of. A new door had been opened. At the same time, the news that the imperial court would take the lead in setting up a shipping group spread rapidly among the merchant groups. A large number of small and medium-sized merchant groups began to rub their hands and get ready to join the wave of ocean trade. For the other territories in the China region, they could only look up to it. The Great Xia dynasty's actions had already left them far behind. They could barely even see their backs. Even if Di Chun and the others wanted to set up a similar shipping group, it would be useless if they couldn't go out into the ocean. Thinking that in the future, the merchant groups under their command would also have to rely on the Huaxia Shipping Group to carry out ocean trade, Di Chun and the others were even more depressed. What worried them even more was that the top talents attached to their families saw the recruitment notice from the Great Xia dynasty and were ready to make a move. On one side, they were idle and had nothing to do. On the other side, they were placed in important positions and could display their expertise. This temptation was indeed hard to resist. It was only a matter of time before they lost their talents. After all, these top talents were only working for their families, not servants. A small recruitment notice stirred up the entire China region. Only the Great Xia dynasty could have such power. Ouyang Shua had no time to care about the waves in the outside world. He had more important things to do. The establishment of the Huaxia Shipping Group was just the prelude to the group operation strategy that Ouyang Shua had planned for the dynasty. There would be a large number of similar groups to be set up to improve efficiency. In the textile industry, with the advent of the loom and the promotion of silkworm rearing as an opportunity, they would cooperate with the Textile Industry Association to set up the Huaxia Textile Group to further integrate the upstream and downstream of the industrial chain. In this way, they could adjust the layout of the textile industry in the counties and eliminate the rising crocodiles. The promotion of the loom could transform the entire textile industry, increase efficiency, and expand production, but could also easily cause the local government to swarm over, resulting in redundant resources and excess production capacity. To a large extent, this risk could be avoided by the unified deployment of the textile group controlled by the imperial court. Another thing was to prevent some local gentry from wantonly expanding and forming so-called silkworm rearing and weaving families, which would then become local tyrants and impede the governance of the local government. To a certain extent, the establishment of the textile group would cut off the soil for the survival of these tyrants. Now that the dynasty was newly established and the tyrants had not yet formed, it was the best time to act. When the tyrants gradually formed, it would be very difficult to cure them, and Ouyang Shuo would not be able to control it. In the construction industry, Ouyang Shuo was prepared to separate the construction functions of all levels of the construction department and set up the Huaxia Construction Group to undertake a series of work such as the design, construction, and construction of the dynasty project. Reducing the burden on the local government was Ouyang Shuo's goal for the next period of time. The construction department was not only the supervisor of the construction market, but also the participant of the construction project. It was equivalent to being a referee and an athlete, so it was very easy to breed construction corruption. Zhang Tingyu had already reported to Ouyang Shuo that the construction departments at all levels were the hardest hit areas of corruption. Setting up the Huaxia Construction Group to separate the functions of construction and supervision could, to a certain extent, put an end to such corruption. Of course, it was impossible to completely cure it. Taking this opportunity, he could also encourage the people to participate in the construction of the dynasty. In the future, the construction industry of the dynasty would become more open and more competitive. There were many similar group operation plans. Some were ready to be implemented, some were still in the evaluation stage, and some were still hovering in Ouyang Shuo's mind. Although it was a good thing to set up a group, there were also many entanglements of interests. If the action was too big, it could easily cause unrest in the dynasty and cause instability in the hearts of the people. Therefore, it was necessary to make a timetable, one by one, starting from the easiest and the most urgent. Ordinary groups could be deployed by the cabinet, and there was no need for Ouyang Shuo to do it personally. The benefits of group operation were obvious. The dynasty would push non-structural functions to the market and give birth to the initial capital market, which was one of the seeds of industrialization. In the process, there would be crimes, collisions of wealth, entanglements of interests, and even blood. But for the dynasty, this would be a milestone change. Chapter 905. P.S. Thank you to the Dragon Stallion Army High Command Group for collectively rewarding the 3 Alliance Lords. Sheng Xiao thanks you. If you want to join the High Command family, group number 423055295. Authentication is required to enter the group. Another benefit of the group management strategy was that it could greatly increase the dynasty's financial income. According to the calculations of the Ministry of Finance, when the collectivization strategy was officially implemented, the revenue of the imperial court was expected to double. With sufficient revenue, the imperial court would be able to improve the welfare of the people, improve the construction of infrastructure, increase investment in education, medical care, and other fields, accelerate industrialization, support the army, and so on. Only in this way could he continue to strengthen the foundation of the dynasty. At the same time, the demand for talents in the process of collectivization also increased sharply. One Huaxia shipping group had to recruit thousands of elite talents, and the entire collectivization strategy would probably require a scale of hundreds of thousands of people. Even if they used a certain number of NPCs, the demand for high-end talents was still very high. This would be a protracted war that would engulf the entire China region. It would definitely overturn the old talent structure of the China region. Ouyang Shuo had a lot of patience, and he didn't even mind recruiting senior professional managers from other countries. It was already the era of the Federation. How could one not have an international perspective? While Ouyang Shuo was laying out his strategy, Shanghai City welcomed 3 special guests. The 3 of them were all from the Weijing Northern and Southern dynasties. After appearing in the wilderness, they sought refuge in the Great Xia dynasty for their own reasons. The first person to arrive at Shanghai City was a female general. She was Hua Mulan, who had gone to battle on her father's behalf. There was no sound of the machine, only the woman's sigh. 10,000 li to the battlefield, past the mountain pass, as if flying. The northern Qi passed to the golden centipede, and the cold light shone on the iron cloak. The male rabbit's feet fluttered, and the female rabbit's eyes were blurry. 2 rabbits walking side by side. How can you tell if I am male or female? The poem Ode to Mulan told the story of Hua Mulan's legendary life. It became immortal and became a household name. Hua Mulan sought refuge in the Great Xia dynasty. It was obvious that she was after the two female generals, Fan Lihua and Mu Guing. Of the four great heroines of China, the Xia dynasty had already won three, leaving only Liang Hongyu, the heroine of the Southern Song dynasty. Among the four heroines, Hua Mulan was the only one who came from an ordinary family. Before she went to the battlefield, she was just a weaver. She did not learn any martial arts, but she was able to fight on the cruel battlefield for 10 years. Therefore, her experience was even more legendary. It was precisely because Hua Mulan came from an ordinary family that she resonated with them. When Hua Mulan returned from the war, she declined the offer of an official position by the imperial court. She was willing to return home to continue taking care of her parents. This was a sublimation and demonstration of China's traditional filial piety. Therefore, among the four heroines, Hua Mulan was the most ordinary but also the most legendary. She was also the most famous in the future. Name, Hua Mulan, king level. Title, one of the four great heroines dynasty. Northern and Southern dynasties identity. General of the Great Xia dynasty. Profession, Special General. Loyalty, 70 points. Commander, 70. Martial power, 70. Intelligence, 75. Politics, 45. Specialty, Shaolai, increases troop morale by 30. Increases troop attack by 20. Cultivation skills, none. Equipment, Mulan Bao. Evaluation, an ancient heroine of China. Loyal, filial, and chastity. She joined the army on behalf of her father to defeat the invading nation. Her deeds were passed down through the ages. The Tang Dynasty Emperor conferred her the title of General Shaolai. In the game, Gaia had enhanced Hua Mulan once to match her status as a regent general. Hua Mulan, who had just arrived in Shanghai City, rode a black horse and held a bow in her hand. She looked very heroic. Along with Hua Mulan's parents, older sister, younger brother, and the rest of her family also appeared. Ouyang Shuo received the news and personally met Hua Mulan. Greetings, Your Majesty. In the imperial study, Hua Mulan had already changed into female clothes. She also performed the etiquette of a commoner and not the etiquette of a general. Ouyang Shuo's eyes narrowed. Hua Mulan had been able to hide her identity as a woman in the army for 10 years. She was definitely a careful woman. Although it seemed like a small etiquette, it was actually a declaration of her determination. Even if she came to the Great Xia dynasty, Hua Mulan would not have any intention of becoming an official. Ouyang Shuo nodded and said, I am very pleased that General has come to join me. I have already ordered people to buy a house in the city. General can bring your family to settle down in the city. It will be better than being homeless in the wilderness. When Hua Mulan heard this, she looked hesitant. She was a little uncertain. As the saying went, one should not accept a reward without doing anything. If Hua Mulan accepted the house that the king had bestowed upon her, it would be difficult for her to refuse to become an official. However, if she did not accept it, it would be difficult for Hua Mulan's family to settle down in the city, given how prosperous Shanghai City was and how expensive the property prices were. Shanghai City was no longer in its initial stage. It was difficult to make a living just by relying on the basic welfare provided by the government office. Hua Mulan's family made a living by weaving. In Shanghai City, which was the first to introduce weaving machines, they did not have any advantages in skills. It would probably be difficult for them to even provide for a basic living. It's not easy to live in a big city, Hua Mulan sighed in her heart. After the system update, in order to make the historical figures more lively, the historical figures that appeared in the wilderness all brought their families with them. This also indirectly forced the historical figures to come out as soon as possible. Otherwise, their families would have to starve. Gaia had spent a lot of resources to evolve historical figures with advanced intelligence. They were not meant to be placed in the wilderness as decorations. Those historical figures who chose to live in seclusion would not have the opportunity to receive the knowledge of reality because they did not experience the baptism of the territory. They would eventually be eliminated if they did not undergo metamorphosis. When they arrived at Planet Hope, no feudal lord would expend resources to transform them into biohumans. Seeing that Hua Mulan was hesitating, Ouyang Shua continued. I know what concerns you have, General. Why don't you listen to my settlement plan first before making a decision? With that said, Hua Mulan could no longer refuse. She said, Your Majesty, please speak. Ouyang Shua said, The summer palace will be guarded by the Imperial Guards. However, the Imperial Guards are all men, so it will be inconvenient for them to enter and leave the harem. I hope that General will step forward and train a group of female palace guards to take over the harem. This way, General, you will not have to leave the military camp and can still provide for your family. What does General think? Hua Mulan had been in the military for 10 years. She had feelings for the military, so it was impossible for her to really give up. Even when she returned home, Hua Mulan still maintained contact with her colleagues in the military to exchange information. However, Hua Mulan could not balance her military career and family, so she had no choice but to give up what she loved. Ouyang Shua's arrangement was a win-win strategy. When Hua Mulan heard that, she was touched. She cupped her fists and said, Thank you for your grace, Your Majesty. I will carry out your orders. She spoke with confidence and was straightforward. I look forward to General training a group of female guards that is different from the others. General, you can discuss the specific arrangements with the Privy Council and the Queen, Ouyang Shua said. As the leader of the harem, Song Jia had the right to ask about the harem guards. Yes, Your Majesty. Hua Mulan bowed again and took her leave. Ouyang Shua's expression was calm, but his mind was full of thoughts. He came up with the idea of female guards because he liked a talent like Hua Mulan. He could not bear to let her waste her youth in front of a loom. Secondly, it was for Bing Er's safety. Song Jia was highly skilled in martial arts, so her safety was basically guaranteed. Bing Er was different. Although the little girl had practiced the top-notch Heart Sutra, it was only a pure inner force. There were no fighting techniques, so she had no combat ability. Ouyang Shua was worried that someone would use Bing Er to make a fuss. Especially with the emergence of Shaolin, Wudong, and other sects, the situation in Jianghu was changing. There were more and more people in the martial arts world. It was hard to guarantee that someone would not take the risk and kidnap Bing Er to threaten Ouyang Shua. Although there was no real death in the game, Ouyang Shua did not want Bing Er to go to the reincarnation hall. The second person to arrive at Shanghai City was an old man. He was also a scholar. He was the mathematician Zhu Chongji. Zhu Chongji spent his life studying natural science. His main contributions were in mathematics, astronomy, calendar, and mechanical manufacturing. Zhu Chongji's most famous achievement in mathematics was the calculation of pi. Pi was widely used in astronomy, calendar, and other fields. Any problem that involved a circle had to be calculated using pi. How to correctly calculate the value of pi was an important topic in the history of mathematics. Based on Liu Hui's method of exploring the accuracy of pi, Zhu Chongji was the first to calculate pi to the 7th decimal place, which was between 31415926 and 31415927. It was not until the 16th century that the Arab mathematician Al-Kaisai broke this record. Zhu Chongji's accurate calculation of the value of pi was a major contribution to China and the world. Later generations named the calculation after him as Zhu Chongji's pi, or Zhu Pi for short. In addition to pi, Zhu Chongji wrote 5 volumes of Sui Shu, which were included in the famous 10 arithmetical classics. The Book of Sui commented on Sui Shu, saying the scholar could not delve into its profoundness, so he abandoned it. The book believed that the theory of Sui Shu was very profound, and the calculation was quite precise. It was difficult for highly learned scholars to understand its content. It was the most difficult book of mathematical theory at that time. Zhu Chongji also had a lot of achievements in astronomical calendars. The Daming calendar, written by Zhu Chongji, was the most scientific and advanced calendar at that time. It provided the correct method for astronomical research in later generations. The most important part of calendar compilation was the calculation of leap weeks. Zhu Chongji's leap weeks were extremely precise. According to Zhu Chongji's calculation, The length of a return year was 365, 242, 8141 days, which was only 46 seconds away from today's calculation. In astronomy, Zhu Chongzhi also measured the orbital period of the 5 planets, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. He determined that the orbital period of Jupiter was 11,858, and today's measurement was 11862, which was only a difference of 0.0004 years. In the field of mechanical manufacturing, Zhu Chongzhi designed and built novel instruments such as a water roller mill, a bronze compass car, a 1,000-mile ship, and a timer. In addition to his achievements in natural science, Zhu Chongzhi was also proficient in music theory and had done a lot of research on music. He even wrote literary works. He could be said to be an all-rounder. The reason Zhu Chongzhi, a scientific giant, was willing to come to Shanghai City was because of the world-famous Southwest University China Hall. He admired the rich academic atmosphere in the school, and he wanted to devote himself to the study of knowledge, but he had no intention of becoming an official. Ouyang Shuo did not force him. He personally sent Zhu Chongzhi to Southwest University China Hall to take up his post. Chapter 906. Zhu Chongzhi was assigned by Ouyang Shuo to serve as the vice principal of the Department of Physics under the supervision of MOZ. The moment Zhu Chongzhi took up his post, a system announcement sounded in the China server. System announcement. The representative of the School of Arithmetics, Zhu Chongzhi, has become an official in the Great Xia dynasty. He has joined the Department of Physics and has accepted many disciples. At the same time, he has fulfilled the 3 conditions for a school to settle in Shanghai City. System announcement. The School of Arithmetics has officially settled in Shanghai City. Shanghai City is granted the title of Arithmetic's Holy Land as a reward. Congratulations to player, don't say you have no clothes. System announcement. The School of Arithmetics has officially settled in Shanghai City. The existing title of Arithmetic's Holy Land has been automatically replaced with the title of Arithmetic's Holy Land. The title reward of Arithmetic's Holy Land has been canceled. A special building, astronomical weather station, will be granted as a reward. Congratulations to player, don't say you have no clothes. The China server players were already numb to this. The Great Xia dynasty was far more attractive to historical talents than any other territory. The arrival of such talents boosted the reputation of the Great Xia dynasty among the historical figures and attracted more and more historical figures to join them. The cycle repeated itself. At this stage, there was no need for Ouyang Shuo to invite them. A large number of talents would come to join him. This was the snowball effect. Once they gained an initial advantage, the snowball would become bigger, and the advantage would become more and more obvious. Ouyang Shuo had no time to pay attention to this and check the attributes of the astronomical weather station. Name, astronomical weather station. Type, special building. Function, astronomical meteorological observation accuracy increased by 400 features. Attraction rate increased by 20. Dynasty popularity increased by 5. Description. This is a building specially set up to observe celestial bodies. It can observe stars, predict weather, and forecast climate change. This must be a simplified version of the weather station. In ancient times, weather prediction was a major event, whether it was for agriculture or for war. If the weather could be accurately predicted, it would greatly improve the efficiency of agriculture. The third person to join the Great Xia dynasty was the Northern Wei agronomist, Jia Sixi. Jia Sixi was from Shouguang, and his life was unknown. He was once the governor of Gaoyang. His book, Qimin Yao Shu, systematically summarized the agricultural knowledge of the Yellow River Valley since the Qin and Han dynasties. Qimin Yao Shu consisted of chapters on farming, grains, vegetables, fruit trees, livestock, brewing, seasoning, conditioning, and foreign products. It was the earliest and most complete agricultural encyclopedia in China. Compared to Zhu Chongzhi, Jia Sixi was not a pure scholar. He had been a herdsman for a long time and had personally participated in agricultural production. He was a master of theory and practice. He was a master of the 100 schools of agriculture. After the meeting, Ouyang Shuo appointed Jia Sixi as the head of the Department of Agriculture of the Executive Yuan. At the founding of the dynasty, the Department of Agriculture was promoted to the Department of Agriculture. Under it were the Department of Water Resources, the Department of Land Reclamation, the Department of Forestry, the Department of Fisheries, and the Department of Animal Husbandry. These 5 departments were in charge of the agriculture of the dynasty. The former Director General of Agriculture, Sun Yanong, was considered an old minister of the dynasty. Unfortunately, his ability was limited, and he did not have the ability to take charge of the overall situation. After the founding of the country, his official position was the Director General of the Department of Agriculture, a 5th-rank official. The position of the head of the Department of Agriculture had been vacant until now. In order to maintain the operation of the Department of Agriculture, the cabinet temporarily appointed Sun Yanong as the head of the Department of Agriculture. A similar situation existed in the Department of Construction. The Department of Construction had departments such as the Department of Planning, the Department of Construction, the Department of Craftsmanship, and the Department of Road and Bridge. The former Director General of Construction, Hao Jiansheng, was the head of the Department of Planning and was in charge of the Department of Construction. The position of the Director General of Construction was also vacant. After the founding of the country, Ouyang Shuo was very careful in every key position. Especially important positions, such as the Director General of Agriculture and the Director General of Construction, he would rather not have them. Of course, Ouyang Shuo did not mistreat Sun Yanong, an old minister. He was prepared to transfer Sun Yanong to the county governor of Zhejiang and county to take over the position left by Mulan Lanyue's promotion to the governor of Morocco. Today, a large number of indigenous NPCs like Sun Yanong had grown up along with the territory. Because of the large number of people, they gradually became the backbone of the dynasty. More than half of the officials at the prefectural and county level of the dynasty came from this group of talents. Especially the batch of officials who studied in Lianzhou College, the predecessor of the Southwest University China Hall, were the best. Because this group of people belonged to the same sect, they were called the academics. The officials who attended the first training course, personally taught by Ouyang Shuo, were even more self-proclaimed as the emperor's disciples. The Great Xia dynasty obtained 3 historical talents, but the other lords did not leave empty-handed. Because of Di Qin's relationship with Fu Jian, Wang Ming joined Handan City. Xie Xian was rejected by Ouyang Shuo and brought the entire Xie clan to join War Wolf, settling in Blood Red City. Wang Shiji, Xie Yun, Xie Daoyun, and the other members of the Wang and Xie clans settled in Blood Red City with Xie Xian. War Wolf used some unknown method to subdue Xie Xian, becoming the biggest winner of the Battle of Yishui. The valiant General Ran Min was recruited by Feng Qiuhuang, while Huan Chong was subdued by Lao Ai. Similarly, the Huan clan also settled in Wanshi City with Huan Chong, filling up the city's talent pool. The other historical figures had not yet appeared, waiting to be recruited by the lords. June 25th, Xuanzhou. Following Sui when Emperor Yang Jian's arrival in Xuanzhou, this southern capital welcomed a round of quiet renewal. The style of the city changed, and it basically inherited the architectural style of the Sui dynasty's capital, the Qing city. The Qing city was the Tangchong and city. When the Sui dynasty was founded, the capital was still in the old city of Chong, and due to the long years of war, it was dilapidated, and the palace was small, unable to meet the needs of a new unified capital. In addition, the city's sewage had accumulated for hundreds of years, and it was difficult to drain. The drinking water supply was also a problem. Therefore, Yang Jian gave up on the old Chong and city to the north of Dragon Head Plains, and chose to build a new city to the south of Dragon Head Plains, southeast of Hanchong City. In the first month of the second year of founding emperor, he ordered Yu Wenkai to be in charge of designing and building a new city, the Qing city. It was completed in the third month of the next year. Yu Wenkai referred to northern Wei's Luoyang City, eastern Wei, and northern Xi's Yedu City, and regarded the 6 high slopes to the south of Dragon Head Plains as the 6 Yao lines of Qian. With this as the core, it became the geographical basis of Chong and city's overall planning. The 6 slopes were the skeleton of the Qing city. The imperial palace, government offices, and temples were all high up, forming a stark contrast with the ordinary residential areas. In the lowlands between the hills, apart from the residential areas, water was diverted and lakes were dug, increasing the water area of the city. The Qing city made full use of the terrain to increase the three-dimensional space, making it look even more majestic. The layout of the city was neat and uniform, and the shape was rectangular. The whole city was made up of 3 parts: the palace, the imperial city, and the outer city. It was completely symmetrical from east to west. The Qing city was the largest city in the world at that time, 24 times the size of Hanchang and city, and 14 times the size of Ming and Qing Beijing. It was 7 times bigger than the capital of the Byzantine kingdom at the same time, and 62 times bigger than the city of Baghdad built in 800 AD. Before that, from the Qin and Han dynasties to the northern and southern dynasties, there was no order or layout in the capital. The imperial palace, the government offices, and the residential areas were all intertwined, and it was very messy. After reaching the Qing city, the balanced and symmetrical layout of the capital began to take shape. The streets were neat and uniform, crisscrossing from north to south, and symmetrical from east to west. The streets and alleys were all orderly. The imperial palace, the imperial city, and the residential areas were separated, and the boundaries were clear. It was both safe and practical. As the chief designer of the Qing city, Yuan Kai had great credit. Yuan Kai was also one of the rare urban planning and construction experts in China's history. The Sui dynasty ruled Xuanzhou, allowing the capital to shine with endless firepower. Whether it was the nobles in the city or the millions of imperial guards, they all became alive from piles of dull data. The imperial power broke through the restraints of the imperial palace and spread to the entire city. Within the city, there was a faint atmosphere of the founding emperor era. In the side hall of the imperial palace, just as Ouyang Shuo was busy receiving Jia Sixi, Sui Wen Emperor Yang Jian also welcomed a messenger. The messenger was none other than Wang Meng. Although Yang Jian, who appeared in the wilderness, was almost 50 years old, he still had a threatening aura. His eyes were incomparably sharp, and the domineering aura of an emperor assaulted one's face. Fortunately, Wang Meng was not an ordinary person. Under Fu Jian's command, he had long cultivated a temperament that was as immovable as a mountain. "You said that you were here on behalf of the Yin-Huang alliance?" Yang Jian said lightly. After appearing in the wilderness, emperors like Yang Jian would automatically be instilled with the knowledge of the wilderness by Gaia. Therefore, although Yang Jian did not leave the palace, he was very clear about the relationship between the alliance of mountains and seas and the Yin-Huang alliance. Wang Meng nodded and said, "That's right. I have come with sincerity." Yang Jian sneered and said, "I'm only guarding one side. Why would I need the sincerity of the Yin-Huang alliance?" In a few days that he had been in Xuanzhou, Yang Jian was in high spirits. While familiarizing himself with the capital, he also arranged for a group of civil and military officials to quickly take over the capital in Xuanzhou County, where the capital was located. The more he understood, the more satisfied Yang Jian was with Xuanzhou's strong foundation and resources. It was already comparable to the Sui dynasty. Because of this, Yang Jian was so confident that he looked down on the Yin-Huang alliance. In these chaotic times, Yang Jian also wanted to make a difference. Wang Meng was unmoved and said calmly, "Your Majesty, I believe you already know the nature of the Great Xia dynasty. The Great Xia dynasty is aggressive by nature, and they're like tigers and wolves. As the saying goes, how can you allow others to sleep beside your bed? The Great Sui dynasty and the Great Xia dynasty are neighbors. Isn't your Majesty worried at all?" "So what?" Yang Jian's eyes narrowed. Wang Meng's words poked at Yang Jian's sore spot. If there was anything unpleasant about appearing in the wilderness, it would be the existence of the Great Xia dynasty, which made Yang Jian extremely frightened. Yang Jian did not expect that the wilderness would actually breed such a monster. The more he understood the Great Xia dynasty, the heavier Yang Jian's heart became. although he did not want to admit it, whether it was in terms of territory, population, economy, military, civil, and military, Great Xia was superior to the Great Sui dynasty. If the Great Sui dynasty only had the resources of a dynasty, then the Great Xia dynasty had the resources of Huaxia for 5,000 years. In terms of geographical location, the Chuanzhou County where the Great Sui dynasty was located was surrounded by the Great Xia dynasty. Even the sea was sealed by the Great Xia dynasty's navy, and the Great Xia dynasty's lifeline was controlled by the Great Xia dynasty. This kind of situation was truly depressing for an emperor who wanted to take revenge. Wang Ming said with a smile, "If your majesty is willing, the Yin-Huang alliance can help the Great Sui dynasty." Chapter 907. Yang Jian glanced at Wang Ming and said, "Yin-Huang alliance has always been defeated by the Great Xia, and now they are even more dependent on the Great Xia. Your words of help are really arrogant." Wang Ming was stunned. He didn't expect Emperor Wen to be so stubborn. An emperor naturally had the pride of an emperor. Before confronting the Great Xia head-on, Yang Jian wouldn't ask for help from others. The million imperial guards were Yang Jian's biggest trump card. Even if the Great Sui didn't have the geographical advantage, they could still stand firm. Wang Ming had no choice but to say, "Your Majesty, please believe in our sincerity. The Yin-Huang alliance is willing to cooperate with the Great Sui at any time. We have a common enemy." Yang Jian waved his hand. "You can leave first." However, he neither refused nor agreed to it. As an emperor, Yang Jian had a tactful side to him besides his pride. He knew that there must be a way out. Perhaps one day, the Great Sui would be in trouble with the Yin-Huang alliance. Wang Ming sighed in his heart and left. This mission was considered a failure. Wang Ming was quite depressed that he messed up the first task assigned by his lord. After Wang Ming left, Emperor Wen immediately summoned Gao Ying. Emperor Wen, who founded the rule of founding emperor, was a pioneer in the dynasty system. His greatest contribution was to abolish the 9-rank system and change it to a system of 5 provinces and 6 departments. This was the blueprint for the Tang dynasty's system of 3 provinces and 6 departments. The 5 provinces were the Minister of Internal Affairs, Menxia, Minister of Literature, Secretary, and Chamberlain. The secretary was in charge of books and calendars. The chamberlain was the eunuch organization of the palace. The central organs were the Minister of Internal Affairs, Menxia, and Minister of Literature. The Minister of Literature was divided into 6 departments: officials, revenue, rights, army, punishment, and works. There was a Minister of Literature who was in charge of all the officials. There was a left and right servitors who were in charge of the 6 officials. The Minister of Literature was an empty title. The left servitor was the real head of the Minister of Literature, equivalent to the Prime Minister. In history, during the reign of Emperor Wen, Gao Ying was the left servitor, Su Wei and Yang Su were the right servitor. Now that he was in charge of Chuanzhou and saw the old officials again, Yang Jian was deeply moved and changed his mind. The most important official, Gao Ying, was appointed Minister of Literature. Su Wei was promoted to left servitor, and Yang Su continued to be the right servitor. The 3 formed an iron triangle and became the 3 most important officials of the Great Sui. After a while, Gao Ying arrived at the side hall. Gao Ying could be said to be a famous minister of her generation. She was talented, courageous, and insightful, and capable of both literature and martial arts. When Emperor Wen of Sui was still the prime minister of northern Zhou, Gao Ying had secretly sought refuge with him. In the meantime, Gao Ying helped Emperor Wen eliminate Yuqi Jiong, clearing the way for Emperor Wen to usurp the throne. When Emperor Wen ascended to the throne and established the Sui dynasty, Gao Ying became the minister of the left servant Shi and the prime minister. At the beginning of the country's founding, Gao Ying and Su Wei worked together. Emperor Wen of Sui first discussed with them on all political matters before implementing them. During this period, Gao Ying presided over the revision of the laws, subduing the Turks in the north and pacifying the Chun dynasty in the south. Gao Ying was also good at recommending talents. Su Wei, Yang Su, Hiru Obi, Han Qinhu, and other famous officials and generals were all recommended by Gao Ying. Unfortunately, during the last years of the founding emperor era, Gao Ying was like the other powerful ministers in history, unable to escape the suspicions of the emperor and falling out of favor. In the end, he was stripped of his title and became a commoner. During the reign of Emperor Yang of Sui, he was executed for slandering the government. Your Majesty, Gao Ying, who had appeared in the wilderness, was already an elder in his 50s. Although his eyes were gradually turbid, they seemed to see through everything in the world. He was incomparably wise. It was unknown if Gao Ying had any knots in his heart at this moment. Emperor One of Sui nodded and recounted Wang Meng's matter. He asked, "What do you think of this matter?" Gao Ying's expression was calm. For an old minister like Gao Ying who had experienced great storms, there were few things that could excite him or make him nervous or afraid. He said calmly, "In my humble opinion, we should wait and see." "What do you mean?" Gao Ying said. "The Great Sui has just established its foundation in the wilderness. It needs a process of integration and adaptation. At present, the situation in the wilderness is unclear. Great Xia's attitude is unclear, and the rules of war are unclear. It's not wise to act rashly." Gao Ying's consecutive 3 unclear made Emperor One of Sui frown. The so-called rules of war referred to Gaia's restrictions on the dynasties. The 4 dynasties that appeared in the wilderness were limited to a county. It wasn't that these emperors didn't want to expand their territory, but Gaia didn't allow it. The 4 dynasties were still like hidden dragons coiled in the abyss, unable to soar into the sky. Gaia wanted to use the NPC factions to temper the lords of the wilderness, but at the same time, they couldn't exploit the lords of the wilderness too much, allowing them to be easily destroyed by the NPC factions. Gaia had a very precise grasp of the scale. Only when the time was right would these dynasties officially participate in the wilderness competition. Gaia was playing a big game of chess. Gao Ying continued, "Although the Yin-Wang alliance has a common enemy with us, they have ulterior motives. Their goal is to let the Great Sui and Great Xia fight each other so that they can reap the benefits. How could the tricks of Di Chun and company escape the discerning eyes of an old fox like Gao Ying? Of course, Di Chun's efforts weren't in vain. The success of sowing discord was gratifying, but even if it failed, it could still plant a thorn between the Great Sui and Great Xia. Since it was so effortless, why wouldn't Di Chun do it?" "You're right." Emperor One of Sui nodded. He had the same guess. "If I'm not wrong, the Great Xia will take the initiative to contact us," Gao Ying boldly predicted. "Xuanzhou maintains close trade relations with the Great Xia, so there's no reason for them to turn a deaf ear to us." At this point, a trace of worry flashed in Gao Ying's eyes for the first time. The biggest crisis facing the Great Sui was not the geographical encirclement, but the fact that the lifeline of the city's supplies was in the hands of the Great Xia, which was really worrying. In the capital, the number of NPCs other than the players was fixed. The number of Imperial Guards determined the total population. According to the ratio of 1 in 10 conscription, the total population of the city was 10 times the size of the Imperial Guards. In Xuanzhou, it had to accommodate more than 11 million NPCs and nearly 10 million players. The population of the entire city exceeded 20 million. What kind of concept was a population of 20 million? Even in the 21st century, when the population was exploding, only the capital, Shanghai, and Chongqing had a population of more than 20 million in China. With the limitations of ancient cities, it was impossible for them to accommodate such a large population. What kind of concept was it to have 20 million people living in a city? Just taking the food consumption as an example, it would consume 20 million units of food every day. It would require the resources of a province to supply such a large amount of food. The people in the city needed more than just food to survive. They also needed vegetables, fish, oil, salt, vinegar, cloth, leather, flour, and other daily necessities. Without an entire province providing blood to the capital, it was impossible to support such a large population. Even so, it had to be a relatively rich province. Slightly poorer provinces would not be able to provide for them. Before the emperor took over the capital, Gaia had always blurred the capital. Although there were more than 10 million NPCs in Xuanzhou, a large number of them were in a state of trusteeship. This way, it would not be a burden to the capital. When Emperor Wen took over Xuanzhou, the trusteeship was gradually lifted. This also meant that if the 4 counties in Minnan province that belonged to the Great Xia dynasty stopped supplying Xuanzhou with supplies, then Xuanzhou would be in chaos due to a shortage of supplies in less than half a month. Of course, this was the most extreme method. Both sides would suffer, and no one would gain anything. If Ouyang Shuo really gave such a despicable order, the Great Sui could only send troops in an attempt to subdue Minnan province with force. War would break out just like that. This was something that no one wanted to see. But no matter what, the Great Xia had the lifeline of the Great Sui in their hands. As such, how could Gao Ying, the minister, not be worried? Emperor Wen was not stupid. He naturally thought of this and agreed with Gao Ying. He was prepared to wait and see. Shanghai City, Xia Palace. Not long after Wang Meng arrived in Xuanzhou, he was discovered by the Mountain Sea Guards. In the past 2 years, the Black Snake Guards and the Mountain Sea Guards had been operating diligently. They had long woven an impenetrable intelligence network in Xuanzhou City. Nothing in Xuanzhou could escape the eyes of the secret agents of the Mountain Sea Guards. When Shun Buhai received the news, he had a premonition that it was a crucial piece of information. He did not dare to delay. After personally verifying it, he immediately reported it to the emperor. Ouyang Shuo was not surprised when he heard this. It would be abnormal if Di Chun and the rest did not use the sensitive relationship between the Great Sui and the Great Xia to cause trouble. This prince understands. Continue to keep an eye on him, Ouyang Shuo instructed. Yes. After Shun Buhai left, Ouyang Shuo turned to Qingyi and said, "Invite the Chamberlain of Dependencies here." Calculating the time, Emperor Wen should have settled down. It was time to make contact with the Great Sui. Yes, there were no eunuchs in the Xia Palace. Naturally, there was no chief eunuch. Qingyi, who worked in the same imperial study as Ouyang Shuo, played the role of a messenger. A moment later, Zhang Yi came with the order. "Greetings, Your Majesty. Have a seat." Ouyang Shuo waved his hand and said, "I called you here because I want you to go on a diplomatic mission." Zhang Yi asked, "Your Majesty, are you referring to the Great Sui?" The only country that could make Zhang Yi, the Chamberlain of Dependencies, personally lead a diplomatic mission was the Great Sui dynasty. Smart. Ouyang Shuo nodded and said, "The Great Sui dynasty and Xuanzhou have always had a close relationship. Both sides have maintained close contact in terms of trade and cultural exchanges. Now that Xuanzhou has a new master, we naturally have to do our best as a host and congratulate them. The trade agreement that both sides have previously signed needs to be reconfirmed." Zhang Yi was startled and said, "Your Majesty, you mean to continue to maintain the cooperative relationship between both sides?" Ouyang Shuo looked at Zhang Yi with a faint smile and said lightly, "Why not?" Zhang Yi was terrified. He quickly stepped out of the ranks and bowed and said, "I misspoke. Your Majesty, please punish me." "All right, I understand what you mean." Ouyang Shuo's expression was relaxed. "Peace is the most important thing right now." "Yes," Zhang Yi responded while thinking about the deeper meaning of the king's words. He was actually a little lost in thought. Chapter 908. June 28th, Xuanzhou. Early in the morning, the bustling city of Xuanzhou welcomed a special team. Honglu Temple official Zhang Yi of the Xia dynasty led a group of officials from the Science, Education, Civil and Defense Bureau and Commerce Bureau to form a group of more than 100 people. They were officially on a mission to the Sui dynasty. 2 days ago, the Xia dynasty's Honglu Temple had informed the Sui dynasty about the mission. The Sui dynasty's minister Gao Ying received the report, and after consulting Emperor Wen, he agreed. This was why the Xia dynasty's mission was here today. Gao Ying represented Emperor Wen to receive the mission and welcome them into the Four Quarters Embassy. In the reception room of the embassy, the two officials met alone. Gao Ying picked up the teacup and took a sip. She asked, What did Emperor Xia say about the mission? The Xia dynasty's mission was not out of Emperor Wan and Gao Ying's expectations. But what was the Xia dynasty's intention? Was it to continue working with the Sui dynasty or to go against them? No one could be sure. Therefore, Emperor Wan arranged for Gao Ying to find out what was going on before the official meeting with the mission. This was to prevent any awkwardness in the court. Zhang Yi smiled. He had the demeanor of a diplomat and displayed the Xia dynasty's character. He said, "My king said that the Xia dynasty and the Chuanzhou imperial court have always been on good terms. Now that the city has changed owners and the Sui emperor has ascended, he sent a foreign official to congratulate him. At the same time, he hopes to maintain good relations with Chuanzhou." Gao Ying heard this and heaved a sigh of relief. She smiled and said, "I will definitely convey Emperor Xia's good intentions." Then, the two old foxes exchanged a few more words, trying to find out the truth of the other party. After chatting for a full hour, Gao Ying left to report the good news to Emperor Wan. Seeing this, Zhang Yi was deep in thought. Now that the Xia dynasty had taken the initiative to be friendly, it was up to Sui to return the favor. Afternoon, Handan City. The news of the Xia dynasty sending a mission to the Sui dynasty had already reached Di Chen's ears. The secret agent of the Imperial Wind noticed that Gao Ying was calm when she left the Four Quarters Embassy. Obviously, the Xia dynasty's mission was not here to cause trouble. Emperor Wan is giving in. Di Chen stood in front of the window and looked up at the sky. He was rather annoyed. Peerless Elegance looked at the man in front of her, who was constantly being thwarted but had never fallen. She let out a long sigh and softly said, "What are you going to do?" Di Chen turned around. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he said, "Tell me, if the Xia kingdom's emissaries were assassinated in Chuanzhou, would they still be able to work together? Will it work?" Unparalleled Elegance hesitated. The Four Quarters Embassy is guarded by the Great Sui Imperial Army, and the diplomatic party of Great Xia is also escorted by high-level imperial guards. It is simply too difficult to assassinate them. Di Chen smiled and said slowly, "You don't have to use a sword to kill someone. You can also use poison." Peerless Elegance frowned and said in surprise, "You want to use number 15? Isn't it not worth it?" Peerless Elegance was in charge of Imperial Wind, so she was very clear about Imperial Wind as arrangements in Chuanzhou. Just like the Mountain Sea soldiers, Imperial Wind had planted spies in the 9 Great King cities. The number 15 that Unparalleled Elegance spoke of was, on the surface, a manager of the Four Quarters Embassy in Chuanzhou. In order to nurture number 15, Unparalleled Elegance had spent a lot of effort. Di Chen shook his head and said coldly, "Great Sui is an important chess piece to keep Great Xia in check. We cannot allow them to work together. If this plan succeeds, sacrificing number 15 will be worth it." "All right, I will do it now." Seeing that Di Chen was insistent, Unparalleled Elegance could no longer object. At the end of the day, Di Chen was still his master. Night for Quarters Embassy. According to tradition, Emperor Wan of Sui would only officially receive the diplomatic party the next day. Zhang Yi had no interest in Chuanzhou, so he naturally would not go sightseeing in the city like Gao Ying had suggested. Zhang Yi stayed in the embassy for the entire day, preparing for the audience the next day. Part of the reason why he did not go out was for safety reasons. Before coming to Chuanzhou, His Majesty had instructed him to be worried that someone would make a fuss about the diplomatic party. The previous time when Ouyang Shua signed a trade agreement with North Sichuan City-State and South Hunan City-State, Lord Chunchen had arranged for someone to assassinate family. This was still fresh in Ouyang Shua's mind. This time, other than the 50 most elite Imperial Guard accompanying them, the Shadow Guards were led by Guardian Chui Tianchi. They would personally protect the diplomatic party in secret to ensure the personal safety of the diplomatic party, especially Zhang Yi. At 6 in the evening, Gao Ying once again came to the Four Quarters Embassy to represent Emperor Wan of Sui to host a banquet for the Great Xia diplomatic party. The banquet was very lively with the accompaniment of singing and dancing. At this moment, a maid served a bowl of nourishing soup as the finale of the banquet. "Please." Gao Ying sat on the main seat and looked at Zhang Yi from afar. Smiling, she said, "This is ginseng soup made from Korean ginseng specially bestowed by His Majesty. It is very nourishing and can also relieve fatigue." Zhang Yi said, "Emperor Sui is very considerate." As he spoke, he picked up the spoon and drank a mouthful. "It is indeed delicious." Gao Ying's expression was very joyous when she heard this. Both the host and the guest were happy. Just as Zhang Yi drank the third mouthful, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. Woo! Accompanied by a sharp pain, Zhang Yi's mouth and nose started bleeding. The bright red blood dripped into the soup and quickly dissolved into a blood flower. Lord! Because they were attending a banquet and they were in the Four Quarters Embassy, he didn't want to attract too much attention. Thus, he only brought 2 Imperial Guard with him. They stood behind Zhang Yi dutifully and kept an eye on the surroundings. The 2 of them immediately noticed Zhang Yi's abnormality. The Imperial Guard's exclamation immediately broke the lively atmosphere of the banquet. The other members of the diplomatic party looked over and saw that their leader was bleeding from his mouth and nose. It was obvious that he had been poisoned. They couldn't help but be shocked and quickly surrounded him. "Lord!" an official from the Commerce Bureau exclaimed. He rushed to the door and shouted, Men! The Imperial Guards accompanying the diplomatic party were standing guard outside the door. Upon hearing the call, they immediately rushed in. The problem was that the banquet hall was guarded by the Great Sui Imperial Army. Before they understood the situation, how could they allow the Imperial Guards to rush in? The 2 groups of Imperial Guards faced each other outside the door. "Move aside." The accompanying Imperial Guard leader had a grave expression. Without hesitation, he unsheathed the Tang saber by his waist. Shua! The 50 Imperial Guards unsheathed their sabers simultaneously. Under the reflection of the moonlight, the sabers gleamed coldly. The Great Sui Imperial Army wasn't easy to deal with either. With a deep voice, they said, "Without orders, no one is to enter." Fortunately, the commanding officer knew the severity of the situation and didn't draw his sword. Instead, he drew his shield. In an instant, the Great Sui Imperial Army erected a shield wall in front of the door. At the same time, the commanding officer intentionally shouted, "Send a team to see what's going on." He said this to reassure the Great Xia Imperial Guards. Yes, a team of Great Sui Imperial Army received the order and entered the banquet hall. At this moment, the hall was already in chaos. Seeing that Zhang Yi had been poisoned, Gao Ying could no longer maintain her composure. The soup ladle in her hand slipped and fell into the poisonous insect. The soup splattered all over Gao Ying, but she didn't even notice it. Gao Ying knew that if Zhang Yi were to be poisoned to death in the Four Directions Embassy, it would be a disaster for Great Sui. At the thought of this, Gao Ying forced herself to calm down and said to the person beside her, "Quick, summon the Imperial Physician." Saving Zhang Yi was the top priority. He mustn't die, Gao Ying prayed in her heart. Just then, Gao Ying rushed into the Imperial Guards and said, "Seal off the Four Directions Embassy. No one is to enter or leave. Take everyone in the banquet hall into custody and interrogate them one by one." Yes, the leader of the Imperial Guards nodded and asked, "Lord, what about the Great Xia Imperial Guards outside?" Gao Ying frowned and thought for a moment before saying, "Let them in." The 50 Imperial Guards couldn't cause any trouble. If they tried to stop them forcefully, they might even get into trouble. Yes, in just a few minutes, Gao Ying had already made the necessary arrangements and controlled the chaotic situation, as expected of an experienced official. After arranging the important matters, Gao Ying walked toward Zhang Yi. Although he was 50 years old, he walked like a gust of wind. When the other members of the diplomatic group saw Gao Ying, they all looked at him with hatred. Zhang Yi looked at Gao Ying in disbelief and said with difficulty, You guys actually poisoned him." Gao Ying said sincerely, "We definitely didn't have the intention to harm you. The Imperial Physician will be here soon." At this moment, Gao Ying couldn't explain too much. He believed that Zhang Yi was an intelligent person. The more he said, the easier it was to be misunderstood. Lord was poisoned after drinking the ginseng soup. How dare you quibble? The members of the diplomatic group were indignant and almost scolded Gao Ying. Gao Ying was expressionless and just looked at Zhang Yi. After a few minutes, Zhang Yi's face had turned black. It was obvious that he was heavily poisoned. Seeing this, Gowing broke out in cold sweat. Zhang Yi looked at Gowing deeply. For a moment, he couldn't determine whether the minister of the Great Sui dynasty was acting or telling the truth. No matter what, Zhang Yi knew that he couldn't panic now. He endured the discomfort and said to the other members of the diplomatic group and the imperial guards who rushed in, "Go back to your room first. Don't act rashly." Yes, Zhang Yi was the backbone of the diplomatic group. No one dared to disobey his orders. After a while, Zhang Yi was moved to his room and laid on the bed. Gowing was stopped outside the door. In the room, Cui Tianqi was already waiting and looked ashamed. Zhang Yi knew that the young man in front of him was the real confidant of the king. He endured the discomfort and said, "This time, the enemy poisoned us. It was impossible to guard against. It has nothing to do with you." "Sir, what do you want us to do?" Cui Tianqi asked. "Send the news back to King City as soon as possible." Zhang Yi was preparing for the worst. "Understood." Cui Tianqi nodded his head forcefully. Somehow, he disappeared from the room. "All of you leave. We'll talk when the imperial physician is here." Zhang Yi dismissed the other members of the diplomatic group. His face turned darker. "Remember, before things are clear, we must not have any conflict with the Great Sui dynasty." Zhang Yi knew the mission he had to shoulder. Seeing Gao Ying's behavior, Zhang Yi would rather believe that it was someone else who poisoned him. Because of this, he couldn't be impulsive at this time, lest he ruin the king's plan. Zhang Yi's life was not important. The king's hegemony was important. Yes, seeing this, the other members of the diplomatic group had no choice but to leave. In an instant, only Zhang Yi was left in the room, lying alone on the bed. No one noticed that Zhang Yi had been holding a small porcelain bottle in his hand. Chapter 909. The porcelain bottle contained an antidote pill concocted by medical sage Zhang Zhongjing. This detoxification pill's effect was incomparably domineering. Although it couldn't guarantee that it could cure all poisons, it could definitely suppress the spread of the poison and wait for the right time to treat it. In May, Zhang Zhongjing took charge of the Imperial Academy of Medicine, and this antidote pill was one of his contributions. Because the herbs used to make the antidote pills were extremely precious and rare, there were only about 100 pills in total. Ouyang Shua didn't keep all of them. All the civil and military officials of the imperial court, especially the generals of the corps commanders, were given one each in case of an emergency. As an official of the office of the Grand Herald, Zhang Yi often went on diplomatic missions and naturally had one. Right now, Zhang Yi was hesitating about whether or not he should immediately take the antidote pill. Zhang Zhongjing had told him that the earlier the antidote pill was taken, the more obvious the effects would be. If one were to consume it immediately after being poisoned, their life would be in no danger. However, if one delayed for too long, the illness might take root and corrode the body. If he waited for the poison to attack his heart, even the heavens would not be able to save him. Zhang Yi hesitated because he could see further. If this poisoning was really not done by the Great Sui, then to the Great Xia, it would be an opportunity to control the Great Sui. Zhang Yi thought it was worth it, trading one's personal loss for the benefit of the dynasty. Thinking of this, Zhang Yi gritted his teeth and decided to gamble. He put away the porcelain bottle and calmly waited for the imperial physician to arrive. After a while, the imperial physician hurried over and Gao and was able to enter the room. She saw that Zhang Yi was barely breathing and his face was filled with black air. Even the blood flowing out of his mouth and nose was black. She became even more worried. The emperor had already received the news and ordered, Zhang Yi must be cured at all costs. After the imperial physician finished his diagnosis, he stood up and went to the side room with a frown. "How's the situation?" Gowing asked. The imperial physician said, "It's hard to say. If I can survive tonight, I won't have to worry about my life. If I can't," Gao Ying's heart trembled. She seemed to have a premonition that a great storm was about to arrive. Only after the imperial physician left did Zhang Yi take the antidote pill. Unfortunately, he was still a little late and missed the best time to take the pill. The poison had already invaded his spleen and kidneys, damaging his foundation. Fortunately, his life was not in danger. Late at night, Great Sui Imperial Palace. In the cold palace, Sui, Wendy, and Gao Ying were still having a secret conversation. "Your Majesty, we must prepare for the worst." Gao Ying's voice was hoarse. Although the incident at night had been dealt with appropriately, it had still exhausted this old official. A bright light flashed in Sui Wendy's eyes as he asked, "Do we have a chance of winning if we fight?" "Less than 30%. Gao Ying's deduction was reasonable. Although the Great Sui had millions of soldiers, it only had one city, and its strategic depth was only one county. If a war were to break out, the Great Xia army would immediately arrive at the city gates. Xuanzhou was an isolated city. Great Xia didn't even need to attack the city. As long as they surrounded Xuanzhou City and trapped it for 10 days to half a month, the city would have a shortage of resources and would immediately fall into chaos. Great Sui's only chance was to take the initiative to attack and fight for that slim chance of survival. 1,000,000 soldiers rushing out of the city to fight was also a difficult opponent for Great Xia. Emperor Sui Wendy was disappointed. He didn't dare to bet on a 30% chance of winning. In the flickering candlelight, Sui Wendy's face became blurry, making it impossible to see through him. After a long time, Emperor Sui Wendy's hoarse voice was heard. "Prepare the conditions for the peace talks." Gao Ying didn't seem surprised and said, "The peace talks are nothing more than ceding land, reparations, marriage, and hostages. Ceding land is ruled out first. Great Sui has no land to cede. Reparations can be negotiated. Currently, the national treasury is still full. We can still take out a few million gold coins." After a pause, Gao Ying looked at the emperor expressionlessly and continued, "Marriage is also difficult. Legend has it that Emperor Xia is a devoted person. He only has one queen in his harem. As for hostages..." At this point, Gao Ying didn't dare to continue. There were a total of 5 princes who accompanied Emperor One in the wilderness. They were Crown Prince Yang Yong, Prince Jin Yang Guang, Prince Qin Yang Jun, Prince Shu Yang Xiu, and Prince Han Yang Qiu. In terms of weight, Crown Prince Yang Yong and Prince Jin Yang Guang had the highest status. In history, Yang Guang ordered Yang Yong's death not long after he ascended to the throne. Therefore, the 2 brothers who appeared in the wilderness had a deep grudge against each other. What was even stranger was that Great Sui's empire was buried in Yang Guang's hands. What kind of attitude did Emperor Wen have towards his second son? Given the short period of time, it was hard to tell. Sui Wendy said what Gao Ying didn't say and said, "As for the hostages, let's choose Prince Jin." No matter what, Great Sui's empire was buried in Yang Guang's hands. Sui Wendy was extremely disappointed in his son. Thinking about what happened on the night before his death, Sui Wendy wanted to order his son to die, to be able to contribute to Great Sui, take it as atonement. Sui Wendy thought to himself, yes, Gao Ying tried her best to maintain a straight face, not revealing a shred of personal feelings or preferences. The heart of an emperor is unpredictable. Sui Wendy lightly changed the topic of the peace talks and asked, "Is there any progress on the poisoning?" Gao Ying said, "It has been investigated. It was a manager of the Four Quarters Embassy who poisoned him while the dishes were being served. We have already captured him and are interrogating him. We must interrogate him thoroughly and give Great Xia an explanation." Sui Wendy was a little frustrated. Ever since he became the emperor, he had never lowered his head to any power. Who would have thought that he would have to lower his head to Great Xia the moment he entered the wilderness? Perhaps I can get in touch with the Yellow Emperor Alliance, Sui Wendy thought to himself. Yes. Gao Ying nodded, and the conversation between the emperor and subject came to an end. After Gao Ying left, a handsome young man walked out from the curtain at the back of the hall. It was Crown Prince Yang Yong. "Father." Sui Wendy glanced at Yang Yong and said, "Our great Sui has just taken over Xuanzhou. There must be many spies like the manager of the Four Quarters Embassy in the city. Your men must get rid of these rats." No emperor would be willing to have spies from other powers in their own territory. Your son understands. Crown Prince Yang Yong, who had appeared in the wilderness, had lost a trace of gentleness and had gained a trace of coldness. Presumably, those unforgettable experiences in history had made this crown prince sigh endlessly. Sway when he looked in the direction where Gao Ying had left and said faintly, "We can't slack off on the surveillance of the officials. The Great Sway is no longer the same as before. I'm afraid that there are people with impure intentions." Yang Yong's heart trembled. He knew that his father was being paranoid again. "Yes," Yang Yong respectfully acknowledged. Within the hall, the figures of the father and son were shrouded in the dim candlelight, drifting about. The next day, the news of the great Xia envoy being poisoned in the Four Quarters Embassy spread like wildfire in Xuanzhou City. In just a morning, the entire China region knew about it. There were those who rejoiced in the misfortune of the great Xia Empire, while there were those who were bewildered. Every move made by the great Xia Empire could affect the minds of the players in the China region. If the two superpowers were to start a war, because of this, it would be a huge matter for the China region. Some players were even more worried that if Xuanzhou City fell, the China region would have one less capital during the national war. That wouldn't be a good thing for the entire China region. Thus, some players petitioned the great Xia Empire on the forums to look at the big picture and not to start a war. Needless to say, there were countless people who agreed with the petition. In just a morning, there were more than 100,000 replies. Shanghai City, Xia Palace. Ouyang Shua naturally didn't pay attention to the petition on the forums. If something really happened that affected the dynasty, the publicity office led by Violet would handle it. There was no need for Ouyang Shua to attend to it personally. Early in the morning, Cui Tianqi came to seek an audience. Upon hearing that Zhang Yi was poisoned, Ouyang Shua was infuriated. He asked in a deep voice, "Was it done by the Great Sway?" Lord Zhang Yi said that it's hard to say. It's more likely that it wasn't. Ouyang Shua's eyes narrowed. In that case, it's possible that a third party was involved? Cui Tianqi remained silent. He was only a shadow guard and couldn't interfere with the court's affairs. Ouyang Shua didn't expect Cui Tianqi to answer. He had a rough idea in his heart. If it was really done by an outsider, it was most likely someone from the Yanhuang Alliance. How presumptuous! Ouyang Shua's face was gloomy. Di Chun and the others kept playing dirty tricks and finally angered him. "If I don't teach you guys a lesson, you guys won't know why the flowers are so red." Fortunately, this matter wasn't urgent. It wouldn't be too late to deal with it after the investigation. Right now, the most important thing was the safety of Zhang Yi and the diplomatic group, as well as the series of diplomatic disturbances caused by this. Around 10 in the morning, more news came from Xuanzhou. Zhang Yi's poison was temporarily under control, and his life wasn't in danger. He just needed a rest and recuperate. He was no longer able to bear the heavy responsibility of diplomatic affairs. At the same time, Gowing also sent a copy of the confession of the suspects to Shanghai City. The contents of the confession made Ouyang Shua very dissatisfied. They didn't even find the mastermind. It seemed that Gao Ying and the others were also quite embarrassed. Along with the confession was a secret letter written by Gao Ying on behalf of Emperor Wen of Sui. It vaguely mentioned the matter of seeking peace. "What conditions does Great Xiao want? Just state them," Gao Ying said in the letter. It was obvious that Great Sui was unwilling to start a war. Ouyang Shua also didn't have the intention to start a war with Great Sui. If they wanted to fight, winning would not be a problem. However, the battlefield was ever-changing. If they weren't careful, they might lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers of Great Xia. If the Yan-Huang Alliance interfered at that time, things would be difficult to deal with. Also, the matter of the Mediterranean Sea hadn't been settled yet. The encirclement and suppression of the Somali pirate Farah hadn't started yet. Ouyang Shua really didn't want to cause more trouble at this time. Otherwise, Ouyang Shua wouldn't have taken the initiative to send a diplomatic group to Great Sui. However, not starting a war didn't mean that Ouyang Shua didn't want anything. Just as Zhang Yi had predicted, Ouyang Shua wouldn't let go of this opportunity that was hard to come by. This time, Great Xia held the initiative in the peace talks. From the looks of it, Emperor Wen of Sui was also prepared to be ripped off. Ouyang Shuo had to think carefully about what conditions he could propose to achieve his goal without touching Great Sui's bottom line. Of course, the premise of the peace talks was to bring Zhang Yi back. Ouyang Shuo ordered a team of Imperial Guards to bring Zhang Yi back to Shanghai City. The Imperial Hospital would be responsible for his treatment. At the same time, he ordered the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, Di Renjia, to replace Zhang Yi and go to Chuanzhou to take charge of the diplomatic group in the peace talks. Ouyang Shuo also wanted to use Di Renjia to investigate the mastermind behind the poisoning. Chapter 9-10. P.S. Sorry for the late update. On the afternoon of the 29th of June, Di Renjia and his group arrived at Chuanzhou and checked into the Four Quarters Embassy. Upon seeing Gowing, Di Renjia's first request was to personally participate in the trial of the poisoning case, which made Gowing feel embarrassed. This request was obviously a sign of distrust towards the Sui Ministry of Justice. But who was the person in front of her? It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was the #1 detective in China. That night, Di Renjia interrogated the suspect. In just one night, Number 15's identity as the secret agent of Imperial Wind was exposed. Once the results were out, Gowing was completely speechless. Sui Wendy was even more furious when he got the news. He didn't expect that Yan-Huang Alliance would put on a show of cooperation, but at the same time, set Great Sui up and put them in a disadvantageous position. Their intentions were truly sinister. Such an action was truly despicable. Ouyang Shuo took this opportunity to raise the first condition of the peace talks. The Great Sui had to set Handan City, Blood Red City, Overlord City, Danyang City, Swordsman City, Luoye City, and Azura City of the Yan-Huang Alliance as enemies. This way, not only would it cut off Yan-Huang Alliance from recruiting people in Chuanzhou, it would also cut off trade between them, and it would also cut off the possibility of Yan-Huang Alliance colluding with Great Sui. Sui Wendy didn't hesitate and immediately agreed. After being tricked, Sui Wendy bore a grudge against Yan-Huang Alliance. Dichen probably didn't expect that this seemingly ingenious move would cause such trouble. He didn't expect Di Renjia to be such a freak that he could pry open number 15's mouth in a single night. As a top secret agent of Imperial Wind, number 15 shouldn't have confessed so easily. How could he be called a godly detective for no reason? Other than that, Ouyang Shuo didn't plan to go easy on Flowing Light Pavilion of Yan-Huang Alliance either. Flowing Light Pavilion was the guardian guild of Chuanzhou's satellite city. Before the battle for the satellite city, the owner of the pavilion had already been bewitched by Silverhand and betrayed Mountain and Sea Alliance to join Yan-Huang Alliance. By the time the dragon-seeking acupuncture point exposed the scandal of Yan-Huang Alliance, Flowing Light Pavilion, and the other guilds were thrown into a storm. The identity of the owner of Flowing Light Pavilion, Junji Lao's illegitimate son, was exposed. Even so, that storm did not cause any serious damage to Flowing Light Pavilion or to old Jun. The traitor from back then was still free and unfettered. This time, Ouyang Shuo wanted to let Jun Yi Lao have a taste of his thunderous methods and the wrath of an emperor. Great Xia's second request for the peace talks was for Great Sui to revoke the rights of Flowing Light Pavilion as the Guardian Guild and choose another guild to guard Star City. As the ruler of Chuanzhou, Sui Wen Emperor had the right to do so. However, he had to pay a small price for breaching the contract. If it was done properly, there was basically no loss to Great Sui. Since that was the case, Sui Wendy had no reason to refuse. As soon as the news came out, the entire Flowing Light Pavilion was thrown into chaos. The Pavilion Master Jun had become the target of public criticism. The old scores of the past were dug up one by one. Without a doubt, it was old Jun's betrayal of the alliance of mountains and seas that dragged the guild into the abyss today. For Flowing Light Pavilion, once their rights to guard the guild were revoked, it was undoubtedly a disaster. In addition, Great Sui was unfriendly towards the Yan-Huang Alliance. It was undoubtedly a death sentence for Flowing Light Pavilion in Chuanzhou. At that time, not to mention guarding the guild, whether or not they could establish themselves in Chuanzhou would be a problem. The life and death of the guild was related to the benefits of hundreds of thousands of members. How could they not be anxious? Flowing Light Pavilion. His actions could not be said to be slow. On the same day that the news came out, Old June was collectively dismissed by the guild and chased out. Of course, Old June's shares in Flowing Light Pavilion were protected by the law and could not be taken back. Even so, for Old June, it was already a disaster. Without the support of the guild, Old June's future as a healer in the game was really worrying. It was likely that he would not be able to make a name for himself again. Without the protection of the guild, Old June was in danger of being killed at any time. As the owner of Flowing Light Pavilion, in the process of Flowing Light Pavilion, its development, Old June had made many enemies in Chuanzhou. Those enemies could not deal with the powerful Flowing Light Pavilion, but to deal with an abandoned guild leader, it was as easy as flipping one's hand. It was estimated that Old June could only guard the shares of Flowing Light Pavilion and live the rest of his life in the game in humiliation. As expected, as soon as he walked out of the satellite town, Old June was assassinated and returned to the reincarnation hall. After this incident, Old June became the first guild leader to be chased out by the founding guild, creating a precedent in the wilderness. A generation of guild leaders fell just like that. It really made people sigh. No one knew if Old June, who stayed in the reincarnation hall, regretted betraying the Mountain and Sea Alliance. Old June probably would not have thought that after so long, Ouyang Shua still held this grudge. Once he seized the opportunity, he would kill him. The miserable experience of Old June made Taoist priest Green Ox of the Laojun Temple and Sword Chi Thunder of the Tingyu building break out in a cold sweat. Both of them, like Old June, were betrayers. Who could guarantee that at some point in the future they would not encounter the same kind of revenge as Old June? Thinking of this, Taoist priest Green Ox could not sleep at night. He regretted the mistake of listening to his master's bewitchment. Even so, there was no turning back. Similarly, the sadness in Sword Chi Thunder's eyes became more intense. Just expelling Old June naturally could not change the fate of Flowing Light Pavilion. They were not that naive. As soon as the new owner of Flowing Light Pavilion, Knight Haoran, was elected, he rushed to Chuanzhou City and urgently contacted Direnjia. He said that as long as Great Xia was willing to withdraw the punishment of Flowing Light Pavilion, they could raise any conditions. Ouyang Shua smiled leisurely when he got the news. Since Flowing Light Pavilion was so tactful, Ouyang Shua naturally stopped while he was ahead. Destroying Flowing Light Pavilion would not be of much benefit to Great Xia. Instead, it would incur hatred, and it was not worth it. This time, if he really completely cut off the source of income of hundreds of thousands of players of Flowing Light Pavilion, their revenge would also make Ouyang Shua's scalp numb. What we need to eliminate is an individual enemy, not an entire group. Ouyang Shua had a clear understanding of this point. Since Flowing Light Pavilion had admitted defeat, Ouyang Shua had no reason to be lenient. How could Ouyang Shua rest assured if he did not completely control Flowing Light Pavilion? Ouyang Shua had experienced enough betrayal, and he would not be so gullible anymore. Therefore, Ouyang Shua raised 3 conditions. First, promote a member of Flowing Light Pavilion to be the deputy pavilion master. This person was none other than a secret agent that the Mountain and Sea Guard had placed in Flowing Light Pavilion. This time, he was only moving from behind the scenes to the front stage, officially representing the existence of Great Xia in Flowing Light Pavilion. Second, cede 5% of the shares and give Ouyang Shua the title of Honorary Pavilion Master. Although the Honorary Pavilion Master did not have any power, he would have the same status and treatment as the Pavilion Master. This way, Ouyang Shua would be able to control this trip at the crucial moment. Third, request Flowing Light Pavilion to merge with Black Cloth Alley, a guild in Chuanzhou, and promote the leader of Black Cloth Alley, Busybody Mountain, to an elder of Flowing Light Pavilion. Without a doubt, Black Cloth Alley was also a guild that was 100% under Ouyang Shua's control. With these three conditions and the secret agent of the Mountain and Sea Guard in Flowing Light Pavilion, Ouyang Shua's control over Flowing Light Pavilion was basically guaranteed, and it would be difficult for him to cause any trouble. With Flowing Light Pavilion returning to the camp of the Mountain and Sea Alliance, Mountain and Sea Alliance regained some ground in the guild circle. They occupied 4 of the 9 Great King cities, which was basically the same as the Yanhuang Alliance. This way, all the schemes of the Silver Hand ultimately fell through. For Great Sway, it was naturally good that they did not have to violate the contract by revoking the rights of Flowing Light Pavilion to guard the guild. It could be said that everyone was happy. However, when he thought about how he was used by Great Xia, Sway Windy felt rather unhappy. However, he had no choice but to lower his head when he was under the eaves. No matter what, he had to swallow this anger. Moreover, these 2 conditions were just appetizers for this peace negotiation. The most important condition had not been mentioned yet. Thinking about this, Sway Windy became even more depressed. Chapter 9:11. Life and death were decided with one word. What happened to Liuguang Pavilion showed the omnipresent influence of the Xia dynasty. Ouyang Shua did not need to use a single soldier. He only needed to move his tongue, and he disintegrated a super guild. This method was far more shocking than the Xia dynasty starting a foreign war. Those who knew the inside story were secretly shocked and increased the danger level of the Xia dynasty by another level. Just as Ouyang Shua was reforming Liuguang Pavilion, Gao Ying represented the Sui dynasty and officially stated 2 conditions. The Sui dynasty was willing to pay 2 million gold coins as compensation and send Prince Jin, Yang Guang, to Shanghai City as a hostage. In order to protect the Sui dynasty's reputation, the compensation was to compensate for Zhang Yi's medical expenses. Although this lie was easily exposed, it was still better than writing compensation in the contract. Gao Ying also expressed that if Emperor Xia was willing, the Sui dynasty was willing to marry a princess. Some of the Sui dynasty's princesses that appeared in the wilderness were already married, and some were unmarried. If he could use a princess to exchange for the stability of the Sui dynasty, it would be a very good deal for Emperor Wen. Unfortunately, this was wishful thinking. When Ouyang Shua heard this, he sneered. He even rejected Queen Kalia, let alone a Sui dynasty's princess. In view of Emperor Wen's cooperation in suppressing Liuguang Pavilion, Ouyang Shua did not hesitate about the 2 million gold coins as compensation and agreed on the spot. The disagreement was on the issue of the hostage. It was the 4th year and 6th month of Gaia. Regardless of the considerations, the Xia dynasty had to bring Chuanzhou County under its rule in the next 1 or 2 years. As such, it did not matter if the hostage was taken or not. As long as Emperor Wen was still alive, it did not matter if a prince died. Moreover, it was a prince that was despised by Emperor Wen. Instead of sending Yang Guang to Shanghai City to cause trouble, why not let him cause trouble in Chuanzhou? Emperor Wen had a good plan. He wanted to use the Xia dynasty to get rid of Prince Jin, but Ouyang Shua would not fall for it. Not only that, Ouyang Shua also asked Di Renji to think of a way to secretly leak the news of Emperor when sending Prince Jin as a hostage to Prince Jin, Yang Guang. It was unknown how useful it would be in the future, but at least it could cause trouble for the Sui dynasty. Ouyang Shua clearly told that Prince Jin did not need a hostage and only needed a civil official from the Sui dynasty. The civil official that Ouyang Shua had his eyes on was none other than the chief designer of Daxing City, Yuan Kai. Great Prosperity City, Guangdong Canal, Rinshou Palace, Ming Hall, and the eastern capital of Luoyang were all built by Yuan Kai. Great Xia did not lack construction talents. What they lacked was a great talent like Yuan Kai, who was proficient in ancient architecture. The Great Sui only had one city, Chuanzhou, and Yuan Kai had no place to use his skills. Emperor Wen of Sui did not hesitate to agree. Ouyang Shua actually wanted Gao Ying, Su Wei, and the other important ministers of Great Sui. If he really brought it up, Emperor Wen of Sui would probably fly into a rage and wouldn't agree no matter what. Thus, the two sides basically reached an agreement. As for the re-signing of the trade agreement, the opening of Chuanzhou Harbor to the outside world, and other business conditions, they were all within the scope of the issue. There was no need to go back and forth to discuss. The envoy group, led by Di Renjia, could make the final decision. Di Renjia still had a secret mission in Chuanzhou, which was to use the opportunity of prying open the 15th mouth of the Imperial Wind to investigate the other secret agents of the Imperial Wind in Chuanzhou. When the news died down, the mountain sea guards would play a game of catching mice in Chuanzhou. Now that the Great Sui was eyeing Chuanzhou, Ouyang Shaw did not dare to mobilize the mountain sea guards, lest they were exposed in front of the Great Sui. As for how to teach the Yin-Huang Alliance a lesson, Ouyang Shaw was still planning and had no idea. He had to hurt the Yin-Huang Alliance, but at the same time, he did not give other enemies an opportunity to take advantage of. It was not an easy task. July 1st, Chuanzhou Palace. The head of the Great Xia envoy group, Di Renjia, paid his respects to Emperor Wen of Sui and presented the Xia kingdom's letter of credence. Since then, the two dynasties had officially established diplomatic relations. They sent envoys to each other's capital and set up an exclusive embassy to serve as a hub for communication between the two dynasties. When the news came out, the ordinary players were elated. They were relieved that the China region had avoided an internal conflict. The players who petitioned on the forum were even more elated. They claimed that Emperor Xia had listened to their suggestions and that this was a victory for the public. In reality, it was just their wishful thinking. Di Chun and the others were disappointed. They had suffered a double loss. As for Old Jun, the victim of the conflict, no one paid attention to him anymore. That afternoon, the envoy group returned to Shanghai City. Along with the envoy group was Yu Wenkai, the former Minister of Works of the Sui dynasty appointed by Ouyang Shaw. Your humble servant, Yu Wenkai, pays his respects to the emperor. Inside the hall, Yu Wenkai paid his respects to his new master with mixed feelings. Ouyang Shaw understood Yu Wenkai's feelings. He had just entered the wilderness and had not even warmed his seat when he was sold by his old master. Anyone would have a knot in their heart. Fortunately, the Xia kingdom was full of youthful energy. There would be a place for Yu Wenkai. Name, Yu Wenkai, Emperor level, dynasty, Sui dynasty identity, civil official of the Xia dynasty occupation, civil official loyalty, 70 points commander, 55 force, 50 intelligence, 85 politics, 75 specialties, construction, increase the efficiency of the dynasty's craftsmen by 20, increase the progress of the dynasty's construction by 15, increase the standard of the dynasty's construction by 25. Remarks. Kai has little equipment and comes from a family of generals. Kai is studious, well-read, skilled, and familiar with the laws and regulations of the past dynasties. He is known as young Master Mingfu. Ouyang Shaw did not hold back against such a talented architect. After meeting him, he immediately appointed Yu Wenkai as the director of the construction department of the administrative yuan, a third-rank official position. The most important thing in front of Yu Wenkai was to plan the establishment of the Huaxia Construction Engineering Group and separate the construction business from the construction department. Hao Jiansheng, the former official who was in charge of the construction department, followed the same path as Sun Yanong. He was appointed by Ouyang Shaw to be the governor of Zhaoqing County in the Lingnan province, taking over the position left by Du Sijing. At this point, the drama between the Xia kingdom and the Sui kingdom had finally come to an end. The only thing that worried Ouyang Shaw was Zhang Yi's condition. According to Zhang Zhongjing, the poison that Zhang Yi had been poisoned with was very strong, and he had missed the best time to take the medicine. The poison had already invaded Zhang Yi's body. Even if he was cured, Zhang Yi's body would probably be weaker than an ordinary person's. Every time it rained, he would experience inhumane pain. As such, how could Ouyang Shaw not be heartbroken? Ouyang Shaw would rather not have the benefits that Zhang Yi's health had to pay. However, at this point, Ouyang Shaw could only accept it silently. His dissatisfaction with the Yin-Huang alliance was getting stronger. Gulf of Aden, Somalia. While Ouyang Shaw was meeting with Yuwen Kai. The Xia Kingdom's Navy governor, Alvaro, led the Atlantic Fleet's 4th and 5th battalions. After spending nearly a month, they finally crossed the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and successfully arrived at the Gulf of Aden. The news shook the entire Mediterranean Sea. A month ago, the Great Xia Kingdom's friendship city in Somalia was attacked by Farah's serious pirates. Farah successfully escaped, causing Great Xia to lose face. Regarding this, the Mediterranean Sea lords were gloating. They even used the ongoing trade negotiations as a bargaining chip to prohibit the Atlantic Fleet from crossing the Mediterranean Sea. The trade negotiations were also put on hold for a while. Their intentions were sinister. The Mediterranean Sea lords did not expect that in just a month, the situation would be reversed. The appearance of the Atlantic Fleet in the Gulf of Aden not only represented the end of the serious pirates, but also meant that Great Xia had opened up a new route that connected the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. As a result, the Mediterranean Sea lords had lost their most important bargaining chip in the negotiations with Great Xia. When the Great Xia negotiating team received the news, they were extremely excited. Under the leadership of Violet, they began to counterattack. The Somali royal family was the most shocked. It was conceivable that once Farah was captured, Great Xia would definitely find out about their shady dealings. When that happened, it would be the end of Somalia. In order not to be feared by the world's lords, the Great Xia Kingdom would not start a war overseas. However, if the Somali royal family's actions were made public, it would be equivalent to giving them an excuse for war. The Great Xia Kingdom could not interfere in the elimination of traitors. Great Xia would definitely not let go of such a good opportunity. A fully controlled Somaliland province was better than a half-hearted Somali kingdom. In particular, Ouyang Shua had long been dissatisfied with some of the previous actions of the Somali lord. A war was inevitable. In the face of the powerful Great Xia Kingdom, Somalia really did not have the will to fight. Although the land area of Somalia was larger than that of Morocco and was equivalent to the combined area of Yunnan Province and Sichuan Province, more than half of the territory was desert, so the population was sparse. The total number of players was less than 800,000. Among them, there were only about 100,000 combat professional players. Correspondingly, there were only 80,000 Imperial Guards in King's City of Wooden Bones. With just this small number of troops, Great Xia did not need to mobilize too many troops. Just the reorganized Somali Corps would basically be able to settle the battle. A few days ago, Di Qing had led the Somali Corps through the teleportation array and entered Friendship City. In order to supply the warships of the Mediterranean Fleet, Ouyang Shua had ordered the construction of a shipyard in Friendship City. As a result, the naval formation of the Somali Corps had a place to settle. Once the warships were in place, the entire Corps could be fully operational. Of course, for the Corps to be completely formed, it had to be tested in actual combat. Because there was no extra space outside Friendship City, even if Di Qing wanted to conduct a large-scale training, it was impossible. The entire Corps could only shrink in the barracks in the city and train day and night, which made Di Qing rather depressed. If there was anyone in the army who was most eager for a war, it would be Di Qing. Because of this, as soon as he received the news, the Somali king was flustered. He immediately sent people out to sea in secret, wanting to find Farah before the Atlantic Fleet and kill him. The two were closely related, but the Somali king was confident. The Somali king did not expect that the entire palace was under the surveillance of the Black Snake Guards. As soon as the team he sent out to sea, they were followed by the Black Snake Guards, who secretly informed the Atlantic Fleet. Chapter 9:12. The Friendship City was the headquarters of the African division of the Black Snake Guards. The Black Snake Guards' infiltration of Somalia had begun as early as the Friendship City was established. On the day the Friendship City was attacked, Ouyang Shua had ordered the Black Snake Guards to thoroughly investigate the matter. By interrogating the pirate captives, the Black Snake Guards were already pointing the finger at the Somali royal family. That was why the Black Snake Guard were monitoring the Somali royal family day and night. On the 3rd of July, on a deserted island in the Amalani Islands in the Indian Ocean. The team sent by the Somali king finally found Farah and agreed to meet him on this deserted island. Farah, who appeared on the deserted island, was a sloppy man. After escaping from the brave port, he had been living in hiding. He had to guard against Great Sia's revenge, but he was also worried that he would be killed by the Somali royal family. He decided to contact the representative of the Somali royal family because he could no longer survive. Although Farah was wandering at sea, he was a player, after all. He could keep abreast of domestic developments through the forum. He already knew that the Atlantic fleet had arrived at the Gulf of Aden. This made Farah feel hopeless. The only one who could help him now was the Somali royal family. It wasn't that Farah didn't think that the Somali king might take the opportunity to kill him. The cunning Farah had long been prepared for this. As soon as they met, Farah said, "I'll say this in advance. I've handed the evidence of our cooperation to one of my confidants. If anything happens to me, this evidence will be made public immediately." The representative of the Somali king was stunned. All his previous plans had been for naught. How could that be? The representative forced a smile and said stiffly, "His Majesty wants to invite you to the palace to discuss countermeasures. He has no other intentions." "That's good." Farah smiled honestly. At this moment, battleships appeared on the sea outside the island. It was the Atlantic fleet. When Farah saw this, he immediately drew his sword and said fiercely, "Are you kidding me?" The representative was even more surprised than Farah. He said anxiously, I definitely didn't bring them here. I'm not stupid. Why would I collude with Great Sia?" Farah immediately understood the crux of the matter. He looked at the representative as if he was looking at a pig and said, "Idiot, you didn't even know that you were being followed. What should we do now?" The representative was even more anxious than Farah. Farah suddenly calmed down and said hoarsely, What should we do? What else can we do? If you don't want to die, surrender now." In the boundless sea, a lone island was no different from a dead end. There was no way to escape. For a player like Farah, who had become a pirate and was publicly wanted in Somalia, even if he committed suicide, he would be reincarnated on the spot. He would not even be qualified to enter the reincarnation hall in the royal city. After becoming a pirate and gaining freedom, one naturally had to pay the corresponding price. Even if he could reincarnate in the royal city, it would be meaningless to Farah. He was afraid that once he walked out of the reincarnation hall, he would either be captured by Great Sia or the Somali royal family. If that was the case, it would be better to be captured by Great Sia. He might even be able to use the evidence in his hands in exchange for a way out. Considering Farah's tactfulness, the Atlantic Fleet's fishing operation went smoothly without any accidents. Even the representative of the Somali king did not want to die. He obediently surrendered and became an unexpected harvest. It further confirmed the fact that the Somali royal family colluded with the pirate leader Farah. July 5th, Friendship City. With Farah as the guide, under the siege of the Atlantic Fleet, the serious pirate group, which had been in the limelight for a while, was completely wiped out in just 2 days. The serious pirates did not only harm the interests of the Great Sia dynasty, but also the interests of the merchants who came and went from the Gulf of Aden. These merchants came from various countries. The destruction of the pirates, to a certain extent, restored the trust that the merchants around the world had in Friendship City and Great Sia. After the war, Farah was escorted to Friendship City. In view of Farah's numerous crimes, which had an extremely negative impact, and the severity of the circumstances, the Internal Affairs Bureau sent a special sentencing officer to Friendship City to publicly try the case. Ouyang Shua also specially invited domestic and foreign media to participate in the whole process of the trial. The goal was naturally to expose the ugly behavior of the Somali royal family and let Great Sia stand on the moral high ground. Thus, the war between Great Sia and Somalia would become a war of justice. Ouyang Shua was still an honorary knight personally awarded by the Somali king. The Somali king's collusion with pirates and attack on the territory of his knight was naturally unacceptable. Even the Somali people would not stand on the side of the king. That was creating momentum. On July 8th, the trial of Farah's case came to an end. Farah was only sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment for his meritorious testimony. In private, Ouyang Shuo personally gave Farah 100,000 gold coins to let Farah stay in prison for a year. To Farah, this was already the best ending. The truth was revealed, and the Somali royal family immediately fell into a wave of public opinion. The Somali players, on the other hand, were deeply worried. They had a premonition that a life and death battle was imminent. As expected, on July 10th, the Great Xia dynasty officially issued a declaration of war against the Somali royal family. The Somali king colluded with pirates, harmed the people, lost the hearts of the people, and destroyed the way of the king. This crime should be punished. Emperor Ouyang Shuo appointed Di Qing as the main general, Navy Admiral Alvaro, and the valiant General Lu Bu as the left and right deputy generals. They led the Somali army, the 3rd Army of the Imperial Guards, and the 4th and 5th formations of the Atlantic Fleet, a total of more than 200,000 troops to conquer Somalia. Just as the army left Friendship City, the Somali players heard a system announcement. System announcement. The Lord of China has initiated a war. Somalia has entered war mode and entered level 1 alert state. Please check the specific situation yourself. In Gaia's eyes, a war was a war. There was no distinction between justice and injustice. The Great Xia dynasty wanted to conquer the Somali king, which was equivalent to initiating a war. Whether it was the warring parties or other people, everyone was well aware of this point. The Great Xia dynasty had done so much preliminary work just for a reason to prevent other countries, especially the African countries and the Mediterranean countries, from intervening in the war in Somalia. If the lords of these countries intervened in this war, they would be interfering in Somalia's internal affairs. If they were to really be the first to do so, they could not blame the Great Xia dynasty for justifiably interfering in the affairs of the African continent and the Mediterranean Sea. Therefore, rather than saying that it was a righteous cause, it was more of a warning. The lords of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea had some clear understanding of this point. System announcement. Somalia has entered war mode. According to the rules of war, during the war, the teleportation circle in the capital will automatically be cut off from the teleportation circle in the territory. Players will not be able to immediately reincarnate if they die. Please inform all players. Somalia was located in the easternmost part of the African continent, the Gulf of Aden to the north, the Indian Ocean to the east, Kenya and Ethiopia to the west, and Djibouti to the northwest. It had the longest coastline in Africa. The eastern coast was a plain with many sand dunes along the coast. The coastal lowlands of the Gulf of Aden were the Jibin Plains. The central part was the Somali Plateau, and the northern part was mountainous. The southwestern part was grassland, semi-desert, and desert. Overlooking Somalia from above, it looked like a large Arabic number 7. The Friendship City was located at the top corner of the 7, and the royal city of Wood was located in the middle of the 7. Like Morocco, the livable zone in Somalia was also along 7 along the coastline. Before the 17th century BC, Somalia established the Punt country, which was famous for producing spices. The current king of Somalia came from the historical Punt country. Spices were also one of Somalia's most famous specialties. Although the population of Somalia was only 800,000, there were as many as 6 territories in the country, 3 more than Morocco. They were scattered along the narrow coastline of Somalia. The reason could only be attributed to the complex tribal colors of the Somalis. Each tribe was the product of the historical city-state system, and no one was willing to submit to each other. As a result, it gave rise to the current scene of Somalia being divided by warlords. Among the 6 territories, 2 were directly controlled by Great Xia. The Black Snake Guards had been plowing in Somalia for a year, and it was not without any results. This was also one of the reasons why Ouyang Shuo had the confidence to conquer Somalia. Moreover, Somalia had neither a historical heritage nor advanced technology. Regardless of whether it was the territorial army or the imperial guards, their equipment was extremely backward, and they were not a match for the Great Xia army. Ouyang Shoa was very confident in taking down Somalia, and he did not even personally lead the troops. This national war was also a training for the Somali army. With Di Qing's ability to command troops, he would definitely not disappoint Ouyang Shoa. Once the announcement was made, the Somali players completely panicked. The war horn had been blown, and they had to fight even if they did not want to. The Somali players began to gather. Today, the players were not as hasty in dealing with the national war as the Star Nation had been in the beginning. They knew that the first thing they did was to gather the combat professional players together and form a joint force. However, they were not confident that they could withstand it. The armies of the 6 territories immediately responded to the call to rescue the king, and they gathered their troops towards the royal city of Wood. With Somalia's military strength, they could only rely on the strong fortress of the royal city. The territorial army alone could not withstand the Great Xia's iron army. The truth was as such. Under the leadership of Di Qing, the Somali army and the 3rd Imperial Guards advanced side by side. They were like 2 hurricanes sweeping from the west to the east and then from the north to the south. Wherever the army passed, the invincible would flee at the sight of the wind. This time, the cabinet had experience. Before the war, they gathered a team of officials to take over the cities that the army conquered along the way. This was to prevent the workload from being too heavy after the war. Such actions reflected the unparalleled confidence of the Great Xia dynasty. From Emperor Xia, Ouyang Shoa, to the civil and military officials in the court, to the ordinary people, no one thought that Great Xia could not defeat Somalia. The only problem was whether it would take a week or half a month. This kind of confidence was the characteristic of a rising dynasty. It was enough to overcome all obstacles and be invincible. Chapter 9:13. On the 16th day of the 7th month, even the bones of the wood were bound. 1 week. It only took the Great Xia army a week to reach the foot of the Somali royal city. At the same time, the Atlantic fleet led by Alvaro had also completed the blockade of the sea around Bone City. The entire capital was surrounded by the Great Xia army. During this period, the Somali Territorial Army had also thought of ambushing the Great Xia army midway to reduce the pressure on the royal city. But it was useless. Whether it was the sturdy fortifications, the ambush traps set by the terrain, or even the poisoning of the water, they were all easily broken by the famous General Di Qing. The meticulous intelligence work of the Black Snake Guards allowed the Great Xia army to march in Somalia as if they were strolling in a courtyard. Wherever there were mountains, rivers, canyons, deserts, the types of troops in the Somali territories, the deployment of troops, and logistical supply points were all grasped by the Black Snake Guards. This was destined to be an unequal war. The resistance of the territorial army was destined to be futile, like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. The Somali army was not good at scheming. Many times, Di Qing beat them at their own game and beat them into a sorry state. In terms of tactics, the Somali army did not have a general who could match up to Di Qing. Even the ferocious General Lu Bu could defeat the enemy's generals. This kind of advantage was overwhelming, and it was not something that could be won by relying on a strong will to resist. Just yesterday, the Somali Imperial Guards carried out the last sniper battle outside the city, but it still ended in a fiasco. The Somali coalition army, who had lost all hope, could only obediently retreat to the capital, becoming a turtle in a jar. The successive victories also ensured that the logistics of the Great Xia army was secure. The officials of the dynasty were practically following behind the army, going from city to city. Even the villages and towns were not spared. The most important task was to gather provisions for the army at the front lines. At the same time, the rations purchased by Great Xia's caravan arrived at the Brave Port. The two supply lines advanced side by side, forming a stable supply route from Friendship City to Bonewood Capital, sending a huge amount of provisions to the front lines. This was also the reason why Di Qing did not directly lead his troops to attack Monarch City, but instead swept through the city. In the ancient battlefield, only cities had the ability to gather rations for the army. An army that had been marching in the wilderness was like a tree without roots. It was impossible for them to last long. What about outside the battlefield? Just as Ouyang Shua had expected, the countries around Somalia fell into a state of silence during the week of war. Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, absolute silence. No African lord dared to stand up for Somalia. Everyone only looked at the powerful dynasty from the east with awe and respect as they conquered Somalia with their iron hooves and exterminated the rebels. The African continent fell into a deathly silence. Even the sea breeze that blew across the continent carried an aura of death, without a trace of coldness. The feudal lord of the Mediterranean Sea was also in a complicated mood, and he wasn't even in the mood to negotiate with the great Xia envoys. Violet was also very understanding and agreed to temporarily suspend the negotiations. Everything would be revealed once the battle in Somalia was over. The great Xia dynasty had never been so revered. They did not even need to mobilize their army, yet they were able to easily massacre a few cities and destroy a country, causing all the feudal lords to be speechless. Other than admiration, there was only reverence. In the barracks outside the city, Di Qing was dressed in military attire. He raised his head and looked at the majestic city not far away, his face expressionless. The mask on his face shrouded this army with a different kind of charm, causing the soldiers under his command to revere him. The wooden bones were all tied, the last hard bone. Attacking the royal city seemed to be a dead end. The rules of a national war determined that both sides would not rest until one side was dead. Other than the fire attack in the Battle of Morocco, both sides would not rest until the last drop of blood. Whether it was the defending side or the attacking side, this kind of mentality was a huge hidden danger. A single mistake could result in heavy losses, and the gains would not make up for the losses. In the Battle of Somalia, Di Qing tried to solve this problem. Di Qing's battle strategy was not worth mentioning, and it was very simple, which was to surround the city. The so-called siege was to surround the enemy without attacking. After a long time, the enemy would collapse without being attacked. There was a saying in Sun Tzu's Art of War: surround the enemy with 10, attack with 5, fight with 2, divide the enemy, defend with fewer, and avoid with fewer. This meant that to surround an enemy army, one would need 10 times the number of the enemy army. This saying was not absolute, and the Battle of Chongping was an exception. Killing God Bai Qi made use of the geographical advantage and trapped the Zhao army with the same number of soldiers, creating a miracle in the history of war. At the moment, there were 80,000 imperial guards, 50,000 territorial soldiers, and 100,000 combat professional players stationed in Bonewood City. In terms of the number of troops, the Allied army even exceeded the Great Xia army. Although Great Xia claimed to have 200,000 soldiers, the actual number of soldiers stationed in Bonewood City was only 150,000. In addition to leaving 20,000 soldiers to guard Friendship City to prevent people with ulterior motives from raiding the base, Di Qing also arranged for 10,000 soldiers to supervise the transportation of rations along the way. There would always be riots and attacks in newly occupied cities. If there was no army to hold the line, the transportation of rations could riot at any time. In order to save manpower, the laborers who were responsible for the transportation of rations were recruited locally, and there was a lot of resentment. Fortunately, the commoners didn't dare to have any ideas in front of the regular army. Di Qing had already made it clear that if there was a riot, they would be beheaded and even punished. If one of the laborers from the same village participated in the riot, the entire village would be slaughtered. The transportation of rations was the lifeline of the army, and Di Qing had to use iron-blooded methods to suppress the rioters. After the army arrived at Bonewood City, Di Qing arranged for 10,000 elite cavalrymen to bypass Bonewood City and continue south to wipe out the remaining cities in Somalia. In addition to the troops guarding the prisoners of war along the way, there were only 150,000 soldiers who could really participate in the battle in Bonewood City, including the 4th Formation of the Atlantic Fleet led by Alvaro. As for the 5th Formation, it shouldered the same heavy responsibility as the garrison of Friendship City. It was stationed in the waters near the Brave Port and guarded the core hub of Friendship City. Friendship City was the link between the dynasty and Somalia, and it was far away from Bonewood City. In addition, the surrounding situation was complicated, so Di Qing had to be cautious to prevent people from taking risks out of desperation. If someone launched a sneak attack on Friendship City, it would definitely be bad news for the Great Xia Expeditionary Army. Fortunately, Sun Tzu's Art of War didn't simply talk about the number of troops, but rather the comparison of military strength. Taking into account factors such as generals, equipment, morale, and tactical literacy, it was roughly estimated that the military strength of the 150,000 Great Xia soldiers was about 4 times that of the Somali coalition forces. Obviously, this was far from meeting the tactical conditions of encircling the enemy from 10 sides. Fortunately, this was a national war, and the Great Xia army had a natural advantage, which was that the Somali coalition forces had nowhere to retreat. Even if they broke out of the encirclement, it would be a dead end. Once the cavalry from the south swept through the southern part of Somalia, other than Bonewood City, the rest of Somalia would fall into the hands of Great Xia. Hence, Bonewood City was truly an isolated city. If the Somali coalition forces wanted to break out of the encirclement, where would they go? Everywhere was a dead end. They could only fight. Therefore, Di Qing wasn't anxious at all. He set up camp outside the city and surrounded Bonewood City so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. While there was still time, the army even began to build fortifications to prevent the Somali coalition forces from acting out of desperation. Di Qing wasn't anxious because there was another decisive factor, and that was that this war wouldn't be interfered with by the outside world. In the Battle of Morocco, Great Xia was the party that started the war for no reason, and it was morally unjustifiable. Furthermore, the situation in the Mediterranean Sea was very sensitive, and they could face reinforcements from the Mediterranean Sea at any time. Therefore, they had to end the war quickly. That was why Jia Su's fire attack strategy was used to exchange for time. However, it was different now. The king of Somalia had broken his promise and stood on the side of the Great Xia dynasty. The other countries had no reason to interfere in this war, and this gave Di Qing space to play. Therefore, the outcome of a war wasn't solely determined by one's ability. The Great Xia dynasty already knew how to make appropriate use of diplomatic means to serve the war and reduce the pressure on the front lines. This was a sign of a great country. After the siege, Di Qing was like an experienced hunter. He began to wait patiently, waiting for the city to fall into chaos, waiting for the chess pieces that Great Xia had buried in the city to play their role, and waiting for the variables that he was looking forward to appear on the battlefield. During this period, Di Qing didn't do nothing. Although the initial sweep was smooth sailing, it also exposed many problems with the Somali army. In order to avoid chaos, other than the Moroccan prisoners of war, the members of the army were mixed in with other field soldiers. In other words, the entire army was a miscellaneous army with a mix of different ethnic groups. It was somewhat similar to the former Qin army during the Battle of Yishui. The core backbone was all middle-level generals that were transferred from other field armies. Such an army naturally had a process of integration and adaptation. Although in order to allow the prisoners of war to smoothly integrate into the new environment, Gaia would vaguely treat the prisoners of war to reduce the obstacles of integration as much as possible. But objectively speaking, there were still difficulties. In the previous few battles, if not for the Imperial Guards holding the line, it was very likely that there would be chaos. In addition, Moroccan's weapons, training system, and military discipline were completely different from the Great Xia dynasty. The newly organized prisoners of war also needed a process of adaptation. Fortunately, Gaia had eliminated the language barrier in the army, or there would be no way to integrate. Taking advantage of the siege, Di Qing constantly paid attention to the movements in the city while speeding up the reorganization of the army. He tried his best to eliminate the hidden dangers. It could be considered as sharpening a spear at the last minute. 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, 10 days passed in a flash. The entire battlefield was dead silent as both sides faced each other in silence. This made the soldiers and civilians in the city anxious. The food reserves were decreasing, and it was obvious that they would not be able to last much longer. As mentioned previously, the population of every royal city was extremely shocking. If there were no supplies from the outside world, the royal city would suffer from a famine in at most half a month. 3 days ago, the Wooden Bones camp had begun to gather supplies. Even so, they would not be able to last more than 10 days to half a month. Hunger began to befall the city, and a commotion gradually arose. Chapter 9:14. At dawn, the ship gradually sailed from the vast Indian Ocean to the coast of Somalia. The flickering lights on the coastal lighthouse were extinguished, and a vast and boundless sea slowly woke up from the darkness. On the rolling sea in the east, a unique sunrise began to appear. The towering mosque minarets on the coast, rows of ancient Arab castles, and a city mainly in white gradually revealed its clear outline in the morning light. Ancient mosques and equally ancient castles formed the city's most ancient heritage. Some mosques had even existed for thousands of years, and after the baptism of time, they still stood tall. This was Magu Toru, a historical ancient city. The blue Indian Ocean set off this white city, making it look clean and beautiful. Looking past the white beach near the port, there was a bustling trade center, and it was also the largest trade center in Magu Toru, mainly selling incense, myrrh, ivory, leather, and other goods. Somalia, known as the land of incense and myrrh since ancient times, was the place that produced the most incense and myrrh and had the longest history. More than 1,000 years ago, an Egyptian nobleman named Hanu was sent by the Egyptian pharaoh to Magu Toru to buy spices. After that, Greek, Persian, and China navigators came one after another. The current commander-in-chief of the Xia kingdom, Zheng He, had sailed to Magu Toru twice in history. When the war came, the surrounding sea was blocked by the Xia kingdom's navy, making the originally bustling trade center abnormally deserted. The shops and stalls were closed one by one, and the whole place looked desolate and dilapidated. Across the desolate trade center, there was a central avenue that ran through the whole city. The avenue was wide and straight, with dense tropical trees and flowers growing on both sides, and there was an endless stream of pedestrians on the street. Although it was only 200 kilometers away from the equator, Magu Toru had a cool climate and verdant forests. It was a scenic spot in Somalia, and all kinds of tropical plants could thrive here. However, the clouds of war shrouded the city, and the pedestrians on the street were mostly in a hurry, their faces full of worry. Acquaintances met each other on the street, and they also talked about the war and the rising price of flour. In addition to pedestrians, camels could be seen from time to time, leisurely walking on the street. Somalia had a lot of camels, and Magu Toru was the only city in the world with more camels than people. The camels were probably the only ones who could not feel the threat of war, but the war would still affect them. The hungry people would eventually turn their attention to the camels. At the end of the central avenue was a square with a mosque and a great hall on both sides. The beige mosque tower soared into the sky, and the great hall sat on a protruding hill like a lion. In the square, 2 bronze statues of heroes stood on a marble base more than 10 meters high. One of them was wearing armor, brandishing a sword, and riding a horse. It was the national hero Muhammad Abdul Hassan. He was a poet, but also a fighter. Further ahead was the Somali royal palace, the center of power in Somalia. The dark clouds of war shrouded the palace as well, causing the oppressive atmosphere of the magnificent palace. In the main hall of the palace, the king of Somalia sat on his throne. His face was haggard, and his eyes were bloodshot. It was as if he had aged a lot. The hall was filled with the smell of decay, causing people to frown. A group of civil and military officials stood solemnly in front of the palace, listening to the king's instructions. In addition, there were 2 uninvited guests. One represented the Somali adventurer player named Abadi, and the other represented the Somali lord named Aidid. "Tell me, What should we do now? The Somali king's voice was hoarse and full of exhaustion. The moment Farah was captured by the Great Sian Navy, the king seemed to have a premonition. He could not sleep at night, and his expression was anxious. His temper was getting worse by the day. In just 2 days, 5 servants had been executed for no reason, shrouding the palace in terror. There was no fluke, and the war came just like that. Because of the king's mistake, the entire Somali kingdom fell into a quagmire of war and could be destroyed at any time. This made the king extremely regretful. He regretted provoking that lion. There was a proverb in Africa: when you can't subdue a lion, don't take the initiative to provoke it. Otherwise, you might get killed at any time. The Great Xia dynasty was not only a lion, but also a majestic lion king. Touch it, and you will die. As the king of Somalia, he had forgotten this proverb and ended up in this situation. At the same time, there was resentment in the heart of the Somali king. He resented the mysterious person who instigated him. The mysterious person who suddenly visited the palace once vowed, "As long as we take down the friendship city, we will have the port and the sea route, and we will be able to bring endless wealth to Somalia." The desire for wealth had seeped into the bones of the Somalis, including the king. The friendship city made a lot of money every day, seducing the king day by day, arousing his greed, and finally losing his mind. Now that he thought about it, it was obvious that the person had ulterior motives. Unfortunately, it was too late to repent now. The Somali king did not even know the name of the person. Greed was the original sin. In the face of the king's inquiry, the ministers looked at each other, their eyes flickering. When the Somali king saw this, he was extremely angry. Of course, he knew what these ministers were thinking. At the beginning of the war, King Xia said that after the war, the old Somali ministers would be treated well. Especially the ministers of the kingdom. As long as they were of good character, they would be valued. This was not an empty promise. Firstly, the king's words carried weight, and secondly, the treatment of the old Moroccan ministers was proof. Therefore, even if Somalia was destroyed, these ministers could still keep their families and even keep their wealth. The only one who would end up miserable and need to be judged would be the king. The relationship between the family and the country had never been as awkward and embarrassing as it was today. Thinking of this, how could the Somali king not be angry? With a murderous expression, he stared at the ministers and almost roared. "Are you all mute? Or are you already thinking of serving the new master?" As he said this, the Somali king's heart was filled with murderous intent. War easily made people afraid, and it also easily aroused people's desire to kill. The king, who was almost overwhelmed by the pressure, was like this at the moment. He was stimulated to the point of wanting to kill. "We are loyal, Your Majesty, please understand." Such words scared the ministers so much that they knelt on the ground, trembling. The ministers lowered their heads one by one, afraid that they would attract the king's attention and be beheaded in advance. "Loyal?" The king sneered. "Since you are loyal, then what do you think we should do now?" Only fight to the death," a minister said in a trembling voice. "Fight to the death. You die or I die." The king's face was gloomy. The minister was so scared that his legs went soft, and he hurriedly said, "This humble minister deserves to die. This humble minister deserves to die." As he said that, he kept kowtowing, almost peeing in his pants. Oof. The Somali king no longer wanted to look at those useless ministers. He turned to the 2 representatives of the mutants who had been silent and said, "What about you? Do you have any ideas?" The mutants, like the king, had no way out. On this point, the 2 sides were standing on the same side. It had to be said that although this king was a little greedy, he was not stupid. Abadi and Aidid looked at each other, and Abadi stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, we have an idea, but speak quickly." The Somali king was so excited that he did not hear the strangeness in Abadi's words. When Abadi saw this, he glanced at the ministers, intentionally or unintentionally. The Somali king understood and glanced at the ministers with disgust. He waved his hand as if he was shooing away flies. "All of you can leave. This humble minister will leave." The ministers could not wait to leave, and all of them ran faster than rabbits. The king was not stupid. He was also worried that these guys would tip off the great Xia dynasty. This was not impossible. He had just curried favor with a new master, so there was no reason not to take credit. However, the ministers did not dare to get into trouble at this time. It was naturally important to take credit, but saving their lives was the most important. After the ministers dispersed, the Somali king asked, "Tell me, what is the plan?" Abadi did not answer directly, but asked, "Your Majesty, do you think we have a chance of winning?" "No." The Somali king's tone was stiff, and his words were very straightforward. The previous few battles were enough to prove that the two armies were not on the same level at all. Now that they were trapped in an isolated city, how could they have any chance of winning? "Then what does your Majesty plan to do?" Abadi continued to ask. The Somali king was a little angry. The mutant in front of him was too rude, and from his tone, he did not take him seriously at all. This was not a question, it was simply an interrogation. The king's temper had been irritable recently, and he was about to flare up on the spot. However, when he thought of the current predicament of the kingdom and the need for the help of the mutant, he forcibly held back. Every king who sat on the throne was not a simple person. Even if we can't win, we have to bite a piece of the enemy's flesh. At most, we will rush out and fight with them, and both sides will suffer. A trace of madness flashed in the Somali king's eyes. That was indeed what the king thought. When people were in despair, there was only madness left in their hearts. Since this country is no longer under his rule, then let it go to hell with him. Seeing this, Abadi said with a gloomy look in his eyes, "In that case, my plan will be useful. Speak quickly." The Somali king's patience was almost exhausted. Abadi was tactful and did not keep him in suspense. "Your Majesty, since you are ready to fight with the enemy, why not go one step further and drive the people in the city to be the vanguard, while our army quietly follows behind? When the people break up the enemy's formation, we will take the opportunity to kill them, and we will definitely win in the chaos." Abadi had heard that the great Xia army would not easily kill civilians. When the Somali king heard this, he was shocked. His eyes widened, and his heart beat violently. This is using the people as bait. Exactly. Chapter 9:15. Abadi's proposal put the Somali king in a difficult position. Driving the civilians as bait, how ruthless was that? As a mutant, Abadi could ignore the lives of the civilians, but as the head of a country, the Somali king had to consider the influence of the people. Once the matter was exposed, he would not be able to be the king. Abadi said faintly, "Your Majesty, we have no other choice. If the country does not exist, how can the people rely on it? Your Majesty, you must think twice about whether the hundreds of thousands of people or the kingdom is more important." The Somali king took a deep look at Abadi and sighed. "That's the only way." A trace of sarcasm flashed in Abadi's eyes. Don't look at the king in front of him putting on a compassionate look. He didn't have a trace of hesitation in his heart. If the king really loved his people, he wouldn't have done something like colluding with pirates. Abadi rose quickly when Farah became a pirate and replaced Farah as the #1 adventurer player in Somalia. Speaking of which, Abadi had to thank Ouyang Shua. If he hadn't exterminated the pirates and exposed Farah's true colors, he wouldn't have today's Abadi. But for the Somali king, not only the Somali people, but also the Somali players hated him because it was this idiot who pushed Somalia into the abyss of war. Originally, Abadi could live a carefree life in Somalia, but in the blink of an eye, he would be sent to the unknown land of trials at any time. Just from a name, it was obvious that it was not a good place. No one would be willing. In fact, Abadi and Aidid never thought of letting the king continue to rule Somalia. When the war subsided, they would stand up and expose the king's crimes today and drive him from the throne. By then, Somalia would be completely under the control of the players. In order to let the people take the initiative to leave the city, the control of food in the city has to be tightened. Only when the people are hungry will they take the risk to leave the city, Abadi said. The Somali king nodded and didn't speak. How could he not understand this logic? August 1st, the bones were all tied. In the past few days, the Somali royal family had given priority to the army and let the soldiers maintain their physical strength, further tightening the food supply to the people in the city. Everyone's rations were reduced by half. The people could only fill their stomachs, and now they could barely get half full. The further they went, the less rations they received. They couldn't even reach half the standard. There was even sand mixed in the flour. It was simply insane. Today, the royal family simply did not provide flour. They directly made bread and distributed it according to the number of people. One person, one day, one piece of dry bread. In the past, this kind of bread would not even be eaten by dogs, but now it was extremely precious. For a time, the people in the city were filled with complaints, but the royal family did not care. They even cried and complained, saying that the soldiers in the army did not have enough to eat and asked the people to bear with it. Even the hundreds of thousands of camels in the city were gathered by the royal family. As a result, hunger began to invade the entire city like a virus. Starving civilians walked the streets and smashed shops in an attempt to find something to eat. Riots could happen anytime and anywhere. As long as no one was killed, the royal family would not care. The royal family's indulgence had undoubtedly intensified the atrocities in the city. Players who could not fill their stomachs would naturally steal food from the commoners. To the defenseless commoners, the combat profession players were even more lethal than the Imperial Guards. How could the commoners defend themselves? They could only wait to be slaughtered. The commoners also robbed each other. The young robbed the old, and the men robbed the women. The strong robbing the weak was the most naked law of nature. Hunger was slowly dissolving human nature and returning to the most primitive law. Because of the robberies, the commoners' food was even more unequal. Some of the old, weak, women, and children could not even get a piece of bread and could only starve. As time went on, they would starve to death at home. The deaths further increased the commoners' panic, and the robbing of food became more and more intense. This was because it was related to their survival. One after another, the robbing of food and the defense of the city continued to play out in the city. It was truly tragic. In order to protect a piece of bread, the commoners did not hesitate to risk their lives. Everyone formed small groups with their families as a unit. They would either starve together or go out together to rob others, leaving others to starve. When there were too many such actions, it was inevitable that there would be casualties. The royal family's attitude towards this was very firm. Once someone was killed, the perpetrator would be executed on the spot. The royal family did this for two reasons. First, it was to kill the chicken to warn the monkey. They were worried that the order in the city would completely collapse. If that happened, even the Imperial Guards would not be able to clean up the situation. Second, it was to increase the commoners' fear. The capital can be chaotic, but it can't be chaotic to the point where it can't be controlled. This was the red line drawn by the Somali king. The Imperial Guards patrolled the city day and night. Once they found a murderer, no matter who it was, they would be executed immediately. Terror and hunger filled every corner of the city, causing the air to become heavy. Everyone knew that the wooden-boned city would not last for more than a few days. In a military camp outside the city, in the main tent, Di Ching looked at the latest situation sent by the spies in the city. His eyes flashed. He knew that the decisive battle he was looking forward to was approaching and could break out at any time. The good news was that the 10,000 elite cavalrymen who had gone to sweep the south of the wooden-boned city had completed their mission and returned to the base camp. This made Di Ching even more confident. Di Ching ordered the troops to be on alert 24 hours a day and be ready to fight at any time. However, Di Ching also had doubts. Since they can't hold on any longer, why not start the decisive battle earlier? Di Ching could not figure out what benefit the Somali royal family would have for the Somali coalition army if they continued to delay. On the contrary, the panic and chaos in the city would spread to the coalition army and affect their morale. Is there a conspiracy in this? Without conclusive information, Di Ching could not come to a conclusion. The war in Somalia affected the nerves of players all over the world. At this moment, countless eyes were staring at the wooden-boned city. There were even many war reporters who personally went to the front lines to bring first-line battle reports for the players of their country. The violent starvation of the wooden-boned city caused dissatisfaction among some democratic people. Some people stood up to condemn Great Xia, saying that the Great Xia army had no humanitarian spirit and was simply a war demon. Ouyang Shua scoffed at this. War was never a game of words, and there was no morality to speak of. Furthermore, this was a game world, and all the rules were set by Gaia. The wilderness followed the law of the jungle, with a strong preyed on the weak. Since it was allowed by the rules, Great Xia was not in the wrong. Truly intelligent players would not be disturbed by these boring people. No one would really sympathize with the NPCs in the game. If they really did that, they would be called fools. Those so-called democratic people who clamored on the forum were either out of their minds or had ulterior motives. As long as the overlords of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea did not make a move, Ouyang Shua could safely defend Shanghai City and wait for the war to end. Once these people could not help but jump out, Great Xia had the means to deal with them. The 2 legions of Imperial Guards were always on standby in Shanghai City. If necessary, Ouyang Shua could even mobilize the Morocco Legion, the Dragon Stallion Army, and other troops to reinforce Somalia. Great Xia was never afraid of any provocation. Of course, this was only a last resort. Ouyang Shua still hoped that the war in Somalia would end smoothly without causing too many waves. After all, every war was a drain on the strength of the nation. The longer the war dragged on, the more troops would be involved and the heavier the burden on the dynasty. August 3rd, early morning. As usual, the morning sun rose from the horizon and shone on Town, which stood by the coast. The difference was that the city did not have the vitality of the past. It had become lifeless, and there were starving people everywhere. Every day, 500 to 600 starving corpses were carried to the city walls and thrown down. If they were not cleaned up, a plague could occur at any time. The starving people wandered the streets like walking corpses. It was a chilling sight. Hunger continued to attack the will of the people to resist. Demonstrations and petitions to open the city gates were performed every day on the central street, and the number of people increased as time went on. Because of Farah's trial, the people were already dissatisfied with the king. Now that their rations were deducted, their dissatisfaction naturally intensified, and everyone wanted to surrender immediately. This made the Somali king even more determined. This group of shameless, unruly people deserves to be sacrificed. At this point, the Somali king no longer had any psychological burden. The imperial guards were stationed around the palace, and the people could not set foot in it. They could only besiege the city gates and clamor for the guards to open the gates and let them out. The news had already spread yesterday. It was said that when the Great Xia dynasty attacked Morocco, they did not do anything to the people who left the city. After the war, there was even compensation for the victims, which gave hope to the Somali people. There were also people who said that there was a mountain of food in the army camp outside the city, all of which were plundered by the army. As long as they left the city, they would be able to fill their stomachs immediately. Such rumors became more and more intense. Anyone who was observant would definitely notice that the rumors spread so quickly because someone was adding fuel to the fire. The secret agent of the Black Snake guards naturally noticed this abnormality, but he was somewhat puzzled. According to common sense, the chaos in the city and the people clamoring to leave the city was beneficial to the Great Xia dynasty. Who would be so kind as to help them secretly? The secret agent of the Black Snake guards could not understand, and the general, Di Qing, was even more confused. He guessed that the king had other secret powers that no one knew about. As soon as he thought of this, Di Qing immediately stopped. This idea was too dangerous, and it was not something that a general should consider. Precisely because of this, Di Qing did not even think of looking for the king to verify the news. It was better to pretend that he did not know about this kind of thing. He could not be too curious. Otherwise, it would arouse the king's suspicion, and that would not be worth it. Especially for a general like Di Qing who was guarding the borders, the king's trust was even more important. Chapter 9:16. The clamor passed, and night fell. The darkness on the horizon gradually approached, rolling and surging. It eroded the wooden bones bit by bit until the entire city was swallowed up and merged with the wilderness. The night wind blew past, carrying with it a foul smell. It was the smell of rotting corpses. Every day, people would starve to death in inconspicuous corners of the city. In the hot weather, the corpses would swell after a day or two, emitting a nauseating stench that permeated the air of the city. Vultures circled in the night sky, ready to swoop down at any time to enjoy a sumptuous meal. The people looked hopelessly at the empty dining table, ignoring the vultures circling overhead. Their eyes were completely numb. This white city had already decayed. Dog barks could be heard from time to time in the pitch-black alleyway, indicating that a fierce battle was taking place there. Perhaps it was only a piece of hard bread that they were fighting over. After a while, the dog's barking abruptly stopped. It was obvious that the dog was too insensible and had been killed. It's a sumptuous dinner. The rumors during the day sped up the restlessness and unrest of the people in the city. Even when night fell, the people still found it difficult to sleep. They asked each other for information and sought a way out. The desperate people were already prepared to break through the city gates. At this time, another rumor spread among the commoners, causing them to shudder with fear. Did you hear? The guard of the west gate was convinced by his family. Tomorrow morning, he will quietly open the gates and let his family out of the city. The person who said this suppressed his voice. Really? Then we can also follow them out. The people who received the news could not suppress their excitement. Let's prepare early. Tomorrow will be crowded, and the guard won't dare to keep the gates open. This is our only chance to escape. We can't miss it. Understood. I'll go pack up and guard near the city gates overnight. Okay, see you at the city gates. Similar conversations were constantly taking place in the city. Thus, an undercurrent was quietly taking shape. It would gather into a vast ocean that would destroy everything. The secret agents of the Black Snake Guard in the city received the news and felt that something was wrong. They reported the information to the outside of the city overnight. With their professional sense of smell, they could smell a conspiracy from far away. When Di Qing received the report, he did not have time to rest and went to the tent to discuss business that very night. Generals, how do you think we should deal with this change? Although Di Qing was the commanding general, he never acted arbitrarily. Instead, he asked for the opinions of the generals first. As the deputy general, Lu Bu sat on the first seat on the left. Being from the Imperial Guards, he was naturally one level higher than the other generals. He said sternly, "If the information is true, we might as well take this opportunity to charge into the city." The long standoff between the two armies had already made Lu Bu a little dissatisfied, and the way the two armies were fighting made him unhappy. That's inappropriate. The one who spoke was a division commander of the Somali army. If the city gates were to be opened, the area around the city gates would definitely be filled with commoners. If the army charged in, they would probably be trapped in the sea of people, unable to break free. Wouldn't it be terrible if the enemy set up an ambush near the city gate? Lu Bu looked at the division commander with disdain and said proudly, "Others might not be able to charge in, but the Imperial Guards definitely can. Who cares if it's an ambush or not? Just kill it." These words were truly domineering. Lu Bu's 3rd Regiment of the Imperial Guards was given the name Dragon Blood Cavalry by His Majesty. It was an elite cavalry unit that was not any weaker than the Tiger Leopard Cavalry. It was not rash for him to boast like this. With the ferocity of the Dragon Blood Cavalry, they indeed had the confidence to charge into the city. Once they held the West Gate, the Bonewood Fortress would definitely be broken, and they would definitely win this battle. The division commander's face turned red from Lu Bu's words, but he couldn't find any words to retort. Even Di Qing was a little tempted for a moment. The long standoff between the two armies would consume a terrifying amount of rations. The rations in Somalia could not be plundered endlessly. If they were forced into a corner and plundered too much, the commoners would also rebel. This battle cannot be dragged on any longer. But Di Qing was a cautious person, and the division commander's words were not without reason. Based on his intuition, Di Qing felt that the events that had happened in the Bonewood Fortress were too strange. It reeked of a conspiracy. It was not appropriate to enter the city rashly. His Majesty had entrusted 200,000 soldiers to him, and Di Qing did not dare to make any mistakes. But to reject Lu Bu's suggestion like this was a little inappropriate, and it made Di Qing feel a little awkward. Fortunately, there were some commanders in the Somali army who could guess that the commander did not agree to Lu Bu's suggestion. It was just that they could not say it out loud, and it would not give Lu Bu face. At this time, it was their subordinates who had to step forward to help. Generals' words are not without reason. The Dragonblood cavalry's battle prowess is unparalleled, and they can charge into the city. Hearing this, Lu Bu was secretly delighted, and he could not hide the expression on his face. But there's one point. This will cause a large number of commoners to die, and it will easily cause chaos in the city. His Majesty ordered us to attack the city, and he wants a complete city, not a city that has lost the people's support. Thus, I think that we need to be cautious about charging into the city gates, the division commander said in a tactful manner. Hearing this, Lu Bu's expression froze. This fierce general was not afraid of the heavens or the earth, but he was afraid of his Majesty. If he really ruined his Majesty's plans, Lu Bu would not be able to bear the consequences. The other party used the Majesty's name to pressure him, but Lu Bu could not refute, and his face was full of indignation. Di Qing glanced at the regiment commander with praise, causing him to shiver in his heart, and he was secretly excited. After appeasing his subordinates, Di Qing turned to Lu Bu and said with a smile, "How about this, General? Prepare 3,000 elite cavalrymen, and we will make a decision tomorrow based on the situation. What do you think?" Lu Bu was not someone who did not know what was good for him, and he could only nod his head in agreement. Furthermore, Lu Bu was not 100% confident of charging into the city gates, and so he did not insist. Up to this point, they still could not come up with a solution. Di Qing, however, had already made up his mind. "How about this? We clear an opening in the west overnight and guide the commoners out of the city to the rear of the army. Then, we will set up a few large porridge stalls at the rear and provide hot porridge for free. This way, the commoners will not act recklessly." Other than the east side of Magoo's citadel, which faced the sea, the other three sides were surrounded by the Great Xiao army. The Central Army camp was set up in the west, and it corresponded with the Atlantic Fleet in the east. If the commoners wanted to leave the city, they would have to pass through the Great Xia camp. Therefore, they had to make preparations in advance. If the commoners were allowed to rush out in a chaotic manner, only God knew what would happen. To the hungry commoners, hot porridge was the best bait to guide the commoners to the designated location of the army so that they would not be in a mess. It had to be said that the starting point of Di Qing's idea was good. It was just that some things were often beyond people's expectations and caught them unprepared. "This is a good idea." The other generals nodded in agreement. Di Qing's expression suddenly turned solemn, and he said, "Letting the commoners out of the city is one thing, but we can't be careless. We can't let the king of Somalia blend in with the commoners and sneak out of the city. During the war in Morocco, the king of Morocco blended in with the commoners and escaped to neighboring Algeria. He even established a kingdom in exile, which brought a lot of trouble to the imperial court. The repercussions were still ongoing. Di Qing naturally could not repeat the same mistakes in this battle. If he let the king of Somalia escape again, he was afraid that he would be laughed at by the other generals. Since we have opened an opening, we have to set up checkpoints and interrogate the commoners one by one to prevent suspicious people from blending into the crowd and fishing in troubled waters, Di Qing instructed. Yes. After the military meeting ended, the barracks began to move. For the army that brought along a large number of craftsmen, doing these things was not very tiring. The only troublesome thing was that they had to clear away some barracks overnight. When a large army was stationed, it was very easy for the soldiers to get nervous. Often, the slightest movement could cause a commotion in the barracks, let alone moving the barracks overnight. If it wasn't for the well-trained Great Xiao army, Di Qing would not have dared to do this. Even so, they were busy until the latter half of the night before it came to an end. On the 4th day of the 8th lunar month, at the west gate of Magoo City, the sky had just brightened, and thousands of commoners had already gathered near the west gate. The commoners were not stupid. Before the gate opened, they did not casually appear on the streets near the gate. Instead, they hid in the houses nearby. They were worried that the generals guarding the city would not dare to let them pass after seeing so many people. The quiet streets seemed to be empty, but in fact, countless pairs of eyes were silently watching them, especially the city gate, which was the focus of the entire city. If eyes could really focus, then the city gate would probably be lit. The Magoo City faced the sea, and there was a thin mist every morning. The thin mist rose up and down the quiet streets. It was hazy and well concealed the people hiding in the houses. Every house was crowded with people, and even the beams were full of people. In order to get out of the city, many people squatted on the beams for the whole night and did not dare to sleep. Everyone was waiting for the arrival of the family of the generals guarding the city gate. Until 7 in the morning, the streets were still empty. Why are they not here yet? Could the news be fake? Some people began to worry. After all, it was only a rumor. Some people began to pray. No, they will definitely come. That family had become the hope of the entire city. Just as the crowd was feeling anxious and uneasy, the sound of a wheelbarrow colliding with the stone pavement could be heard in the quiet street. The squeaking sound was rather eye-catching in the empty street. The crowd was startled and looked out through the crack in the door. Sure enough, they saw a group of people pushing a wheelbarrow with their luggage and quietly heading towards the west gate. It's them. They are here. They are really here. The crowd quickly spread the news while suppressing the excitement in their hearts. Some people were so nervous that they could not even speak, and their throats were tight. They looked at that family as if they were looking at God. Everyone was ready, waiting for the moment the city gate opened. They would rush out of the city gate as fast as they could, escape from this suffocating purgatory on earth. The mist began to slowly dissipate. Chapter 9:17. At the west gate of the city. Creak. The heavy city gate slowly opened under the gaze of countless pairs of eyes, as if a new world had opened up. The family of the guards at the city gate cooperatively walked out of the city gate. At this moment, hysterical shouts suddenly erupted from the houses near the city gate, as if they were charging into battle. Charge! Like magic, tens of thousands of commoners rushed out of the houses. It was hard for outsiders to imagine how such a small house could accommodate so many people. The young lads at the forefront arrived at the city gate in the blink of an eye. These young people were very tactical, directly using a sea of people to block the city gate, preventing the guard from closing it. Following that, more people passed through the city gate one by one, surging out of the city. Looking at the military camp outside the city, the commoners of the royal city felt a sense of closeness. It was truly ironic. Like a flood, once the gate was opened, it could not be closed again. As far as the eye could see, the vicinity of the city gate was densely packed with people. The guards at the city gate did not even have a place to stand, let alone stop them. They could only stand on the city wall and stare dumbfounded at the magical scene in front of them. Start a massacre? That was impossible. The imperial guards were all from the royal city, and their parents and brothers might be down there. How could they do it? If they really started a massacre, they would probably incur the wrath of the masses. The only way was to pretend that nothing had happened and report it to the royal family. The vast crowd rushed out of the city gate like a flood, crossing the moat. What came into view was an endless line of white tents, one after another, rising and falling with the terrain, with no end in sight. Sensing that the commoners would leave the city, Di Qing had ordered the army to train in advance and line up in front of the military camp. The vast army formed one iron blood square formation after another, set up in front of the military camp. The thin white fog also danced in the wilderness, but the soldiers didn't even blink as they endured the fog. The fog condensed into dew, dripping down the cold helmets and onto the similarly cold armor, forming a layer of white dew. The entire army was silent. Not a single sound could be heard. From afar, it looked like a formation of terracotta soldiers, extremely shocking. The soldiers stood with rapt attention, naturally exuding an awe-inspiring murderous aura and the majestic military might. The murderous aura was formless, but it could hurt. The military might was invisible and intimidating in all directions. There should have been the chirping of birds and insects in the early morning wilderness, but they were all frightened into silence by the murderous aura. Animals were the most sensitive. They could predict danger in advance and were afraid of alarming this group of killing gods. It was the same with humans. The silence of the great Xia army and the clamor of the commoners formed a sharp contrast. The commoners running at the very front felt the pressure of this aura and unconsciously slowed down, their hearts trembling. Those who were less courageous were already so scared that their whole body was weak and they could barely walk. This was not an exaggeration. An ordinary person who had never been on the battlefield would not be able to speak in front of the entire army. Those who could stand in front of the stage without trembling in the knees and look directly at the soldiers were all considered brave men. The commoners were bewildered, but the great Xia army made a move. With a schwa sound, the army in the center suddenly spread out, neatly forming a 20-meter-wide passageway. In front of the passageway, there was a checkpoint made of barricades and soldiers lined up on both sides. At the same time, a lieutenant rode his horse to the front of the commoners and said loudly, "Everyone, listen up. The great Xia army has always been kind to the commoners. We have prepared hot porridge at the rear. Please follow the passageway and retreat to the rear in an orderly manner." Great! Hearing that there was porridge to drink, the crowd burst into cheers. There was nothing more blissful than having a way to live and food to eat. Leaving the city was indeed the right choice. The commoners secretly rejoiced. However, the lieutenant's tone suddenly changed, and he said in a deep voice, "The military camp is an important place. Everyone must abide by the rules, obey orders, and accept inspection. Everyone can only gather at the designated location. If you walk around randomly or collide with the military camp, you will be punished according to military law." The commoners were solemn. Looking at the military formation not far away, they knew that the officer in front of them was not lying. "General, don't worry, we know the severity." The leader spoke and was guided to the checkpoint by the lieutenant for inspection. The Black Snake Guards had already sent a portrait of the Somali king. The so-called inspection focused on this person. At the beginning, the scene was still orderly. The commoners who were leaving the city were intimidated by the mighty military of Great Xia and obediently accepted the inspection. After passing through the passageway, they arrived at the square at the back and drank a bowl of hot porridge. The change occurred at about 9 in the morning. As a large number of commoners successfully left the city, the news that the West Gate was opened completely spread throughout the city. There were even rumors that those who left the city were warmly received by the great Xia army and drank hot porridge. This time, there was a complete uproar. There were a total of more than 700,000 commoner NPCs in Magoo City. After receiving the news, this huge team gathered from all corners of the capital like a trickle towards the West Gate. The water droplets converged into a trickle in the small streets, a thin stream on the main street, and a vast river on the central avenue. With an unstoppable momentum, it surged towards the West Gate, as if it was going to drown the gate. The number of commoners leaving the city suddenly increased. The guards at the gate had long given up or received orders. Instead, they changed from bystanders to the backbone of maintaining order at the scene. It was precisely because of the existence of the army that the city gate was not in chaos. Otherwise, just the trampling alone would cause countless casualties. Even so, as time passed, the crowd became more and more restless. This was because there was already news that the royal family was enraged and was preparing to forcefully clear the city gate and close it again. This time, the commoners became even more anxious. The hurried crowd was basically squeezed all the way forward and their feet didn't touch the ground. After leaving the city, they frantically surged towards the checkpoint. The number of people completely exceeded Di Qing's expectations, making the inspection more difficult. The anxious commoners were restless like a huge barrel of gunpowder that could be ignited at any time. The speed of the checkpoint inspection was far slower than the speed of the commoners leaving the city. As a result, a large number of commoners gathered in the open space between the Great Xia barracks and the city walls. As time passed, the number of people lingering in the city increased, forming a huge black mass that was about to exceed the number of soldiers. The lingering crowd, in turn, reduced the speed of the commoners leaving the city. Even if they left the city, they had nowhere to stay and were simply squeezed. This time, the commoners who had yet to leave the city became even more anxious. The crowd was surging and seemed to be out of control. Di Qing stood on the high platform and frowned. This can't go on. Sooner or later, there will be trouble. Di Qing was very clear about the situation and was even more worried. This was a group of people who were constantly tortured by hunger, fear, and anxiety. When things got out of hand, these people would do anything. Somewhat. Here, Di Qing ordered, temporarily set up 5 more checkpoints and evacuate the people to the rear as soon as possible. Yes, sir. It was impossible to disperse the crowd, and the safest way was to evacuate the crowd to the rear as much as possible so that it wouldn't affect the army. Di Qing didn't forget that there were more than 200,000 Somali coalition soldiers hidden in the city. The Great Xia army was far from being free of worries. Di Qing once again ordered the entire army to be on standby and ready for battle. Even Lu Bu's expression became solemn. Looking at such a dense crowd, Lu Bu's heart trembled. At this moment, it was difficult to even walk out of the city, let alone break through the city gates. How terrifying! Very quickly, the 5 temporary checkpoints were set up. As a result, the inspection speed was greatly increased, and a large number of commoners were able to enter the rear. The crowd was slightly dispersed and became less dense. However, Di Qing didn't know that there were a large number of Somali professional combat players hidden among these commoners. When the players took off their equipment, they were no different from NPCs. Time was tight, and it was impossible to detect them. These players quietly gathered at the rear and looked at the Great Xia army with a cold glint in their eyes. Di Qing's response only slightly dispersed the crowd, but it didn't solve the root of the problem. There were 700,000 commoners living in Magoo City. In addition to the large number of players with ulterior motives, the number was even larger, and it was impossible to disperse them. Even the hot porridge prepared at the rear was used up time and time again. The food for hundreds of thousands of people was no different from locusts. Everywhere they passed, nothing was left. The military rations were consumed at a speed visible to the naked eye, but Di Qing couldn't care less. He knew that if he didn't let the commoners have a full meal, the situation would be even worse. Di Qing already had some regrets. If he had known earlier, he would have resolutely fought back and not allowed anyone to leave the city. Right now, it was hard to get off the tiger. Di Qing faintly felt that there was a pair of eyes in the dark, silently watching everything. There must be a reason for this abnormality. Di Qing couldn't understand why the Somali royal family would tolerate the commoners leaving the city. Without the people, what was the point of defending an empty city to the Somali royal family? At around 11 a.m., Di Qing's worries came true. The Somali king, who had planned everything, finally bared his fangs and delivered a fatal blow. The change first occurred at the city gate. Suddenly, the sound of marching troops could be heard on the crowded street. It was the royal city guards. The leading general said loudly, "Everyone, listen up. We are under the orders of His Majesty to seal the city gate. Please disperse quickly, or else you will be punished for treason." Wow! The crowd was shocked and turned pale with horror. Their first reaction wasn't to disperse, but to desperately rush toward the city gate. As a result, the order at the scene, which was already on the verge of collapse, finally collapsed with the arrival of the royal guards. It was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. This collapse could no longer be stopped, and it turned into rolling flames that burned everything. The surging crowd desperately rushed out of the city gate and even attacked the people who were waiting to be inspected. Panic and chaos spread like a virus. It was unstoppable. The vast crowd was no longer willing to be inspected, and they were about to rush the checkpoint and retreat to the back. When Di Qing saw this, his face instantly turned pale, and he muttered to himself, "It's chaos. Everything is chaos." P.S. Let me say one thing. During the recommendation period of the book, for advertising posts and negative comments in the comments section, especially those that affect the judgment of new readers and have strong personal subjectivity, the moderator will delete the post plus ban to avoid affecting the recommendation effect. This is also the usual practice of authors, especially newcomers like Sheng Xiao. It wasn't easy for him to recommend the book last time, so he will be very decisive in deleting and banning the post. If there are any accidental injuries, Sheng Xiao can only say sorry. You can contact me on QQ to lift the ban. Don't do it again. That's all. Chapter 9:18. On the battlefield in the western suburbs, it was a shocking scene. Overlooking the entire battlefield from above, one would see a shocking scene. The Great Xia army was located in the west, with a total of 80,000 soldiers. Below them were two infantry divisions of the Somali army, the Direct Brigade and the Musketeer Brigade, and the three cavalry divisions of the Dragonblood Cavalry. Di Qing personally oversaw the Central Army, accompanied by Ma Chao. The north and south could be seen as the two wings of the Central Army. Each had 20,000 soldiers, including half of the infantry division of the Somali army and a cavalry division of the Dragonblood Cavalry. The commander of the south was Ma Tung, the commander of the Dragonblood Cavalry division, while the commander of the north was an infantry division of the Somali army. In the east was the navy, led by Alvaro, with a total of 20,000 soldiers. The remaining infantry division and cavalry division of the Somali army were not on the main battlefield. The infantry division was responsible for guarding Friendship City, while the cavalry division was mainly responsible for the safety of the rations and the custody of the prisoners of war. On the entire battlefield, the cavalry was the most numerous, and they were all from the Imperial Guards. Next were the infantry, and the navy was only slightly inferior to the infantry. This was also one of the reasons why Di Qing chose the siege tactic. Although the cavalry was not good at attacking cities, they were good at intercepting the enemy in the wilderness. The four armies encircled King City's wooden bone city tightly. The most shocking was still the western suburbs. As a famous general, Di Qing's arrangement of troops was still meticulous even before the war started. The 80,000 soldiers formed a long military formation across the wilderness of the western suburbs, forming an impregnable steel isolation belt with the cavalry in front and the infantry behind. On both sides of the military formation, there were elite cavalry guards. 6 temporary checkpoints and their passages divided the military isolation belt into 7 sections. In the middle was the command center, which was guarded by the Direct Brigade and the Musketeer Brigade. Behind the isolation belt was an empty wasteland. Thousands of large iron pots were temporarily set up to cook porridge and distribute it to the citizens of Monarch City who had fled here. Before the commotion began, there were already more than 70,000 citizens gathered here. In front of the isolation belt was also a wasteland. Due to strategic considerations, forests were not allowed near Monarch City, not even shrubs because it was barren. There were more citizens gathered on the wasteland than at the back, a total of 120,000 to 30,000. Because the crowd was so dense, it was almost stuck to the military formation. The commoners at the very front could already smell the pungent smell of the war horses. Behind the crowd was the moat and the white city wall. Only the drawbridge and the west gate were connected to each other. Before the riot began, there was still a steady stream of people pouring out of the city gates, gathering into the sea of people in the wilderness. At the same time, the city gate was densely packed with people. The streets, the houses, and even the roofs were filled with people. Even further away, a large number of people were gathering from all over the city. The entire western suburbs were filled with people as far as the eye could see. How could they not be shocked? Due to hunger, the small West Gate became the only escape route for the 700,000 citizens of King City. The sudden arrival of the Somali Imperial Guards and the announcement that they were going to seal the city gates naturally caused an uproar among the crowd. Hundreds of thousands of people riding together. What kind of scene would that be? The citizens of Royal City, who were stuck between the city walls and the barracks, were like startled birds, desperately squeezing out of the city. As a result, the pressure began to spread from the city gates, forming a monstrous wave that engulfed everything. It was like throwing a stone into the calm surface of a lake, creating circles of waves from inside to outside, from near to far, continuously spreading outwards. The surging crowd split into 6 arrowheads from the 6 checkpoints and crazily surged towards the rear of the army. People squeezed and pushed each other. It was impossible to continue the checkpoint inspection. If they were to forcefully inspect now, a riot would be right in front of them. Even soldiers who had been through hundreds of battles felt their palms sweating at the sight of such a crazy crowd. The situation was gradually getting out of control. Di Qing looked at the chaotic battlefield and said, "Pass the order to the various divisions. Stay where you are and form an external formation." "Yes, sir." Di Qing was not only worried that the Somali king would take advantage of the chaos to escape, but he was even more worried about the Somali coalition forces in King City. If the enemy launched an attack at this time, it would be terrible. It was precisely because of this that the army could not fall into disarray. As long as the army stabilized their position, any wave caused by the citizens would not be enough to change the direction of the war. At this moment, a scream suddenly came from the empty space in front of and behind the isolation belt. Ah! Even in the hustle and bustle of the scene, this scream was still ear-piercing. Accompanied by the scream, a middle-aged man in the crowd was seen lying in a pool of blood with a sharp knife in his chest. Blood was gushing out, soaking the yellow soil beneath him. It seemed like he would not be able to survive. "Oh no! Murder! Murder!" The sudden blood and death caused the crowd to become more and more frenzied, and they desperately squeezed forward. In order to create more chaos in the crowd, the Somali players did not hesitate to wave their butcher's knife at the NPC citizens. The first scream was like a signal to move. Following that, screams continuously sounded from the crowd. It was like the god of death, mercilessly harvesting fresh lives. A few tigers mixed into a group of sheep, and when the tigers revealed their fangs, what would the situation be like? The already restless crowd completely exploded, and the surging crowd rushed towards the checkpoint recklessly. That checkpoint, that passageway, seemed to have become the dividing line between life and death, between peace and war. It was especially eye-catching. But was the checkpoint safe? Not necessarily. At this moment, another scream came from the checkpoint passageway. This time, the scene was completely chaotic, and there was no longer a safe place. The frenzied crowd began to rush towards the military formation. In the hearts of the citizens, at this moment, only the Great Xia army, this group of hateful invaders, could protect them. How ironic. Retreat, retreat quickly. Facing the surging crowd, the cavalry on the periphery raised their long spears with a biting cold glint. These cavalrymen were all from the Imperial Guards. They were determined, calm, and unmoved. Their bodies emitted an awe-inspiring, murderous aura, causing people to shrink back. There was no doubt that if someone really rushed into the formation, these ruthless cavalrymen would definitely stab with their long spears. The crowd was stagnant. However, behind the cavalry, the infantrymen from the Somali army were somewhat flustered. Most of the members of the army were prisoners of war from Morocco, and they did not have much combat experience. In the face of such a large formation, it was inevitable that they would not be able to adapt. Fortunately, the backbone generals of the army were from other field armies, and they quickly stabilized the formation. Right now, the only thing the army could do was to form a square formation and not be separated by the crowd. Once they were separated and caught in the sea of people, the consequences would be unimaginable. No one knew how many assassins were hidden in the crowd. The citizens were intimidated by the army and did not dare to attack the formation. They could only desperately rush to the rear. In their hearts, the rear was already the last place of peace. Unfortunately, they were ultimately going to be disappointed. Not long after the assassination, tens of thousands of professional Somali players, who had quietly assembled at the rear, took out their weapons one by one and bared their fangs at the Great Xiao army. Kill! Kill the invaders! The players shouted slogans and waved the butcher's knife at the Somali army. The attack was so sudden that the infantrymen of the army were caught off guard and suffered heavy losses. What a treacherous scoundrel! The Great Xiao army was furious. They immediately turned around and fought with these players. In the process, the formation was inevitably impacted. Fortunately, the army was well-trained and could still fight with the mutants while blocking the surging crowd. The most innocent people were the commoners of the capital. They were like a bunch of rabbits, panicking and out of their wits. Yet, they continued to provoke trouble. As the fighting at the rear gradually intensified, the commoners who were originally at the rear were like frightened birds and fled to the wilderness further away, without hesitation. The Great Xiao commander, Di Qing, looked at everything with an ashen face. He had no time to consider whether the Somali king had already escaped from the encirclement. The most important thing at the moment was how to control this chaotic situation. The Central Army, which was divided into 7 parts, was surrounded by people in all directions. The scene was extremely chaotic. The best way was to gather the entire army together. However, Di Qing did not dare to do so. If they were to cut off the checkpoint and disperse the crowd, the situation would only worsen. Without the escape route, the crowd would recklessly rush toward the army. This passage had already become a lifeline for the commoners to escape. Only by leading the crowd deeper into the wilderness could they survive this crisis. Therefore, not only could they not cut off this passage, but they also had to arrange for soldiers to maintain the safety of the passage and be responsible for eliminating the assassins hidden in the passage. What a great irony! Di Qing thought that the current chaos was already the worst situation. Unfortunately, he still underestimated the enemy's viciousness. Just as the situation became more chaotic, the Imperial Guards who were previously ordered to seal the city gates were mobilized again. This was a cavalry unit. After issuing the warning to seal the city gates, the Imperial Guards seemed to have received some kind of signal. When the chaos outside the city started, they immediately ignored the commoners near the city gates and directly charged toward the city gates. It was easy to imagine what kind of tragedy it would cause if a group of cavalry charged through a densely packed crowd. In an instant, dozens of people couldn't dodge in time and were trampled to death by the warhorses. Whoosh! Strangely enough, in that instant, the crowd in front miraculously made way for the cavalry unit. The people would rather be thrown into the crowd and squeezed into meat patties than face the trampling of this group of demons. It had to be said that the potential that erupted in a critical moment was really amazing. The cavalry unit quickly rushed to the city gates. The strange thing was that they didn't take the opportunity to close the gates and complete their mission. Instead, they rushed out and rushed into the crowd outside the city. How can this be? The commoners near the city gates couldn't believe their eyes. Their army actually disregarded their lives and wantonly trampled on them. They were even more abominable than the Great Xiao army. What kind of cold-blooded king have we chosen? The commoners' faces were pale, and their bodies couldn't stop trembling. Their hearts were completely cold and filled with despair. These commoners didn't know that to the Somali king, sacrificing some commoners was nothing in order to preserve his life and the throne. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.